Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The moment I saw those tracks in the snow, I knew something was wrong. They weren't like any I'd seen before, and I've been a park ranger for nearly 10 years. I've dealt with wolves, bears, coyotes, even the occasional mountain lion. But this was different. I could feel the cold tightening around me, a chill that wasn't just from the biting wind. Something primal, something deep inside me, screamed that I shouldn't follow. But it was my job, and curiosity has a way of overriding instinct. That morning had started like any other. The sun barely peeked through the thick canopy of evergreens as I began my patrol. The winter snow had come early this year, leaving the forest buried under a heavy, untouched blanket. It was the kind of quiet that always made me uneasy. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant echo of the river. Just the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground and the occasional snap of a branch in the wind. I was about 2 hours into my patrol when I found the tracks. At first, I thought it might be a bear, big, heavy prints spaced wide apart, leading deeper into the woods. But something about them was off. The tracks were too large, too defined, and they weren't from a quadruped. These were bipedal. I crouched down, brushing the snow off one of the prints. It was clear, deep, and about twice the size of my own boot. 5 distinct toes, but elongated in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. The stride was long, unnaturally so. Whatever made these prints was walking on 2 legs, but not like a human. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing. Just that same eerie quiet. My hand instinctively rested on the radio clipped to my belt, but I hesitated. What was I going to say? That I found some weird tracks? My supervisor, Dan, would probably laugh and tell me it was just a bear dragging its paws through the snow. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to follow the tracks, just to be sure. As I moved deeper into the forest, the light began to fade, even though it wasn't that late in the day. The thick canopy overhead blocked out most of the sun, casting long shadows across the snow. The tracks led through a winding path of dense trees, twisting and turning as if whatever made them knew exactly where it was going. There was no hesitation in the prints, no signs of stopping or wandering. It had a destination in mind. After about 30 minutes of following the trail, I began to notice something strange. The trees around me started to change. Their trunks were scarred, with deep gouges that looked like claw marks. Some of the branches were snapped off, hanging limply from the tops of the trees, as if something tall had brushed against them. The smell hit me next, musky, sour, like wet fur and decay. I gripped the strap of my backpack tighter, my heart starting to race. My breaths came out in visible puffs of steam, quicker now as I felt the weight of the isolation pressing in. The tracks continued on, unbroken, leading into a darker part of the forest where the trees seemed to close in on each other, blocking out the little daylight that remained. The thought crossed my mind to turn back, to report this and let someone else deal with it. But my legs kept moving, drawn forward by some combination of duty and morbid curiosity. I needed to know what this thing was, even if every instinct told me to run the other way. After another 10 minutes, I noticed something odd. The tracks changed. They went from large, deliberate strides to shorter, more erratic steps, like whatever was making them had started to slow down or limp. The snow around the prints was disturbed, kicked up as if it had started dragging its feet. I stopped and knelt down, brushing the snow aside again. There were drops of something dark, nearly black, staining the white surface. Blood. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I followed the trail for another 100 yards before the trees opened up into a small clearing. There, lying in the snow, was a deer carcass. It had been torn apart, its flesh shredded as if something had taken out its frustration on the poor animal. The head was missing, the limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The snow around it was stained red, steam rising faintly from the exposed organs. My throat tightened. The thing I had been tracking wasn't just wandering aimlessly. It was hunting. I took a step back, the urge to leave now overwhelming. But as I turned to go, a sound stopped me cold. A low, guttural growl. It came from the tree line just beyond the clearing, deep and rumbling, like the sound of a bear mixed with something more, something intelligent. My pulse quickened, my hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm strapped to my hip, though I knew it would be useless against whatever was making that sound. I scanned the trees, my breath shallow, eyes wide, then I saw it. At first it was just a shadow, barely visible through the thick brush. But as it moved, I caught glimpses of fur, dark, matted fur, glistening with snow and blood. It stood on two legs, towering over the underbrush, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was massive, muscular, but hunched over, its arms long and powerful, ending in claws that glinted in the dim light. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. It had the shape of a canine, long snout, sharp teeth visible even from this distance, but there was something human in its eyes. Dark, intelligent, calculating eyes that locked onto me the moment I saw it. There was no mistaking it. This was what had made the tracks. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, feel the cold sweat dripping down the back of my neck. The creature's breath came out in heavy puffs, misting the air around its face. Then, slowly, it began to take a step forward. I didn't think. I just ran. The sound of my boots crunching through the snow echoed in the stillness of the forest. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the trees, its growls growing louder, more aggressive. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder, dodging between trees and jumping over fallen branches, trying to stay ahead of whatever was chasing me. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of its massive form moving through the trees with terrifying speed. It was faster than I expected, closing the distance between us. My lungs screamed for air as I fought to keep my pace, the cold air burning my throat. I wasn't going to make it. I knew that. Then I saw the ranger station in the distance, a small wooden structure barely visible through the thick trees. Hope surged through me, and I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain in my legs and the fear clawing at the edges of my mind. If I could just make it inside, maybe I'd have a chance. I stumbled up the steps, nearly falling as I reached the door. My hands fumbled with the key, shaking so badly I could barely get it into the lock. I could hear the creature closing in, its footsteps heavy, its growls vibrating in the air around me. Finally, the door swung open, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I collapsed against the wood, gasping for breath, my body trembling with adrenaline. Outside, I could hear it pacing, its heavy breaths just on the other side of the door. The door rattled as the creature slammed into it, growling and scratching at the wood. But the station was built strong, reinforced for situations just like this. For bears, I reminded myself, not for whatever this was. For hours, I sat there, listening to it circle the cabin, its low growls vibrating through the walls. Eventually, the sounds faded, and silence returned to the forest. But I didn't leave the station until morning, when the sun was high in the sky and the tracks outside had disappeared into the trees. I never saw it again. But the tracks, the ones that had circled my cabin, they were there. They had been watching me long before I had seen them. And I know deep down that it's still out there, watching, waiting. Story 2. I've always been a skeptic. As a wildlife photographer, I've spent countless nights alone in the wilderness, and I've never seen anything I couldn't explain. But after what happened in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, I'm not so sure anymore. My name is Mike Brennan, and this is the story of the night that shook my beliefs to the core. It was supposed to be a routine trip. I'd heard rumors of increased Sasquatch sightings in the area, and while I didn't believe in such things, I figured it'd make for an interesting photo series. Maybe catch a bear or two on camera, show people how easy it is to mistake normal wildlife for something more extraordinary. I packed light, just my camping gear, a week's worth of supplies, and my trusty cameras. The hike in was uneventful, the October air crisp and invigorating. By late afternoon, I'd found the perfect spot, a small clearing nestled between towering pines with a babbling creek nearby, ideal for wildlife to pass through. As I set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to my imagination, fueled by the local legends. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual as I secured my tent and set up my camera traps around the perimeter. Night fell quickly, as it often does in the dense forest. I warmed up some freeze-dried stew over my portable stove, the familiar routine calming my inexplicably frayed nerves. The forest was alive with its usual nocturnal symphony, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. I was about to turn in when I heard it, a long, low vocalization that echoed through the trees. It wasn't quite a howl, not quite a roar. My first thought was a bear, but something about the pitch and duration felt off. I grabbed my camera and night vision scope, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every snapping twig, every gust of wind had me on edge. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a thunderous crash. My heart pounding, I fumbled for my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating my campsite. My breath caught in my throat. My carefully arranged gear was scattered everywhere, as if something had rummaged through it. That's when the smell hit me, a pungent, musky odor that turned my stomach. I'd encountered plenty of wild animals in my career, but this was different, stronger, almost human, but not quite. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. I swung the beam toward the sound, and for a split second I caught a glimpse of something large, bipedal, covered in dark fur. It was gone in an instant, melting into the shadows with surprising agility for its size. I'd like to say I was brave, that I grabbed my camera and gave chase, but the truth is, I was paralyzed with fear. I retreated to my tent, zipping it up as if that thin layer of nylon could protect me from whatever was out there. Sleep was out of the question now. I sat huddled in my sleeping bag, straining my ears for any sound of the creature's return. The forest had gone eerily silent, as if every living thing was holding its breath. Just before dawn, I heard it again, that same unnerving vocalization, but closer this time, much closer. Something large moved past my tent, so close I could hear its breathing. Heavy, rhythmic, intelligent. The sun couldn't rise fast enough. As soon as there was enough light, I cautiously unzipped my tent. The campsite was a mess. My food bag, which I'd carefully hung in a tree the night before, was gone. Tracks crisscrossed the soft earth, massive human-like footprints that made my size 11 boots look tiny in comparison. With shaking hands, I took photos and measurements. The rational part of my brain searched for explanations. A bear walking on its hind legs, perhaps. But I knew bears. This was something else entirely. I retrieved my camera traps, both eager and terrified to see what they'd captured. Most of the photos showed nothing unusual, a few deer, an owl, the usual forest residents. But the last few images on one camera made my blood run cold. They were blurry, taken in the darkest part of the night, but there was no mistaking the massive ape-like figure moving through the frame. The proportions were all wrong for a bear, long arms, a conical head, and most disturbingly, eyes that seemed to glow with reflected light. I'd like to say I stayed, that I pursued further evidence, but the truth is, I packed up my gear as fast as I could and got the hell out of there. The hike back to my car was a blur, every shadow seeming to hide some primeval predator. Back in civilization, I debated what to do with my evidence. Part of me wanted to shout it from the rooftops to prove that there was some truth behind the legends. But I knew how it would look. Just another crazy person claiming to have seen Bigfoot. In the end, I kept the photos to myself. I told my editor I hadn't gotten any usable shots and took some time off. I needed to process what I'd experienced. It's been months now, and I still struggle to make sense of that night. I've returned to the forest several times, hoping to catch another glimpse, to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things. But whatever I encountered seems to have vanished back into the myth it came from. Sometimes, when I'm editing photos late at night, I swear I can still smell that musky odor. I find myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I don't know what I saw out there in the Gifford Ponchot. Maybe it was a known animal behaving in a way I'd never seen before. Maybe lack of sleep and an overactive imagination got the better of me. Or maybe, just maybe, there are things in this world that defy our understanding, creatures that have managed to stay hidden from scientific scrutiny. All I know is that I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. There's a wildness out there, a mystery that can't be captured in a photograph or explained away by reason. And sometimes, when the wind whispers through the trees just right, I swear I can hear it calling me back. So the next time you're hiking in the deep woods and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, like you're being watched, remember my story. And remember that sometimes the legends we dismiss might have more truth to them than we're willing to admit. Story 3. The howl that echoed through the forest that night wasn't from any creature I'd ever heard before. It sent chills down my spine and made me question everything I thought I knew about these woods. My name's Mike, and I've been a forest ranger here in the Cascade Mountains for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff out in these woods, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night in late October. It was a typical autumn evening, crisp and cool with a light breeze rustling through the pines. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. I was finishing up my rounds, checking on the campgrounds, and making sure all the day hikers had made it back safely. As I drove my truck along the winding forest road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods seemed quieter than usual, like all the animals were holding their breath. I chalked it up to the changing seasons and tried to focus on getting back to my cabin for the night. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound that started as a growl and rose to a bone-chilling howl. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. In all my years out here, I'd never heard anything like it. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck, scanning the darkness. The beam of light cut through the gloom, illuminating the trunks of towering pines and thick underbrush. Nothing moved in the shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast forest. "Anyone out there?" Silence was my only answer. I was about to get back in the truck when I noticed something on the ground near the edge of the road. Crouching down, I shone my light on what looked like a footprint pressed into the soft earth. My breath caught in my throat. The print was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot. It was vaguely human-shaped, but the toes were too long, ending in what looked like claw marks. Whatever had made this print was walking on 2 legs, but it sure as hell wasn't human. I stood up quickly, my eyes darting around the darkened forest. The feeling of being watched intensified, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. I hurried back to my truck, locking the doors behind me. My hands shook as I started the engine. As I drove back to my station, my mind raced with possibilities. Could it have been a bear? No, the print was all wrong, and bears don't walk on 2 legs for extended periods. A hoax, maybe. But who would be out here in the middle of nowhere playing tricks? I radioed in to report the strange occurrence, careful to stick to the facts without speculating. The last thing I needed was for word to get out that the local ranger was spooked by Bigfoot. I could already imagine the ridicule from my colleagues. Back at my cabin, I tried to settle in for the night, but sleep eluded me. Every creak of the old wooden structure, every rustle of wind through the trees outside, had me on edge. I kept replaying the sound of that howl in my head, trying to match it to any animal I knew. Nothing came close. Just as I was finally drifting off, a loud thud from outside jolted me awake. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. It sounded like something heavy had hit the side of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and pistol, moving cautiously to the window. Pulling back the curtain just a crack, I peered out into the darkness. The moon had risen, casting long shadows across the clearing where my cabin stood. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then, a movement at the edge of the trees caught my eye. A massive dark figure stood just beyond the tree line. It was hard to make out details in the gloom, but I could see that it stood on two legs and was covered in what looked like thick, shaggy fur. Its head seemed oddly shaped, almost pointed at the top. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things, but when I looked again, the figure was still there. It shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting the moonlight. Eyes that were looking directly at me. My breath froze in my lungs. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other across the clearing. I had the overwhelming sense that I was face to face with something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world of smartphones and satellites. Suddenly, the creature turned and loped back into the forest, moving with surprising speed and grace for its size. I watched, transfixed, as it disappeared into the shadows, the sound of breaking branches marking its passage. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my cabin, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside, half expecting to find the whole thing had been a vivid dream. But there, in the soft earth at the edge of the clearing, was a line of those massive footprints leading off into the forest. I followed the tracks for a while, my camera in hand to document everything. They led deeper into the woods, weaving between trees and over fallen logs. Occasionally, I'd find tufts of coarse, dark hair snagged on bark or branches. After about a mile, the tracks suddenly vanished. It was as if the creature had simply disappeared into thin air. I stood there in the quiet morning forest, feeling lost and more than a little scared. As I made my way back to the cabin, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to report it all, to bring in experts and launch a full investigation. But another part of me, a part that felt older and wiser, knew that some things in this world are better left undisturbed. In the weeks that followed, I kept a close eye on that section of the forest. I never saw the creature again, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind was just right, I'd hear that haunting howl echoing through the trees. It was a reminder that no matter how much we think we know about the world around us, there are still mysteries out there, hiding in the shadows of the wild places. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, what I heard, and I know that these forests hold secrets far older and stranger than most people could ever imagine. Now, when hikers or campers tell me about strange noises in the night or odd tracks they've found, I listen a little more closely. I warn them to be careful, to respect the forest and its inhabitants, all of its inhabitants. Because out here in the wilderness, you never know what might be watching you from just beyond the firelight. As for me, I still patrol these woods every day, but I do it with a newfound respect and a touch of fear. Because now I know that in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest, there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us that we're not always at the top of the food chain. And on nights when the moon is full and that lonely howl echoes through the pines, I make sure I'm safe inside my cabin, doors locked, wondering what ancient eyes might be peering in through the darkness. Story 4. There's a certain kind of silence that blankets the wilderness at night, one that crawls under your skin and sets your nerves on edge. It's not the absence of sound that gets you, it's the weight of the quiet, like something is out there, watching, waiting for you to make a move. Tim and I had camped in remote areas before, but this was different. This silence was different. It started as a weekend escape from the stress of city life. Tim and I, best friends since college, had always talked about getting away, finding a quiet spot where no one could reach us, where the noise of the world just stopped. He found the perfect place, a remote stretch of wilderness, miles off the nearest highway, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense woods. No cell signal, no other campers, just the two of us, some cold beers, and the tranquility of the forest. That was the plan anyway. The drive up had been uneventful, aside from the road. The dirt track was rougher than we'd expected, deep ruts, fallen branches, potholes that looked like they could swallow my truck whole. It was like the woods didn't want us there. By the time we finally pulled into the clearing where we'd set up camp, the sun had already started to dip below the tree line, casting long, creeping shadows over the ground. "This place is perfect," Tim had said, cracking open a beer and leaning against the truck, eyes scanning the thick line of trees surrounding us. "It's like we're the only two people left in the world." I nodded, but something about it already didn't feel right. The forest was too still, the kind of stillness that makes you question if you're really alone. I told myself it was just the strangeness of being so far off the grid. I wasn't used to the isolation. That's all it was. We set up camp quickly, pitching the tent, gathering firewood, and starting a small fire before the night settled in completely. By the time the stars blinked into the sky, we were sitting around the fire, the light casting flickering shadows on the trees. Tim was talking about a recent job offer he'd gotten, some big opportunity in the city, but I wasn't really listening. My attention kept drifting to the dark line of trees, the way the flames of our campfire seemed to reach out toward them, only to be swallowed by the night. "I'm telling you, man, it's a sign," Tim said, taking a swig of his beer. "The pay is great, and it's exactly the kind of challenge I've been looking for. It's like the universe is throwing this opportunity right at me." "Yeah, sounds like a good deal," I replied, my voice distant. I was still watching the trees. That's when I heard it, a low, rhythmic crunching noise, like something heavy stepping on dried leaves and twigs just beyond the firelight. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Tim must have noticed me tensing up because he turned toward the trees. "What's up?" "Did you hear that?" I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on the darkness. "Hear what?" "There was something. Footsteps." Tim laughed, brushing it off like it was no big deal. Probably just a deer, man, or a raccoon. But I wasn't so sure. The noise had sounded too deliberate, too heavy. I strained my ears, listening for anything out of place, but the night had swallowed the sound again, leaving us with only the crackle of the fire. For a while I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that Tim was right. We were deep in the wilderness. Of course there'd be animals. But even as the conversation picked back up, I couldn't relax. My eyes kept darting to the shadows just outside the firelight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something bigger than a deer or a raccoon. The fire burned low, and eventually Tim got up to grab more wood from the pile we'd gathered. As he disappeared into the darkness for a moment, I felt my stomach tighten. I didn't like the idea of either of us being outside the circle of light. When he came back, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "You all right, man? You've been weird since we got here," Tim asked as he tossed a few logs onto the fire. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just getting used to the quiet, I guess." But the truth was, It wasn't just the quiet. It was the quiet mixed with the overwhelming sense that something was watching us from the shadows. Later that night, after we'd both retreated to the tent, I lay awake, listening. Tim had fallen asleep almost immediately, his soft snores cutting through the stillness, but I couldn't drift off. My mind kept replaying that sound, the heavy footsteps, the crunch of leaves, and it only seemed to grow louder in my memory. I shifted in my sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable, when I heard it again. At first it was faint, like something moving through the underbrush far away, but then it grew louder, closer. The same deliberate heavy steps, slow and methodical, as if something was circling our campsite. My heart pounded in my chest, and I strained my ears to listen, every muscle in my body tensing. Then I heard it, breathing. Low, ragged, labored breathing. It sounded like it was just outside the tent. I held my breath, frozen in place. The sound of whatever it was moved closer until I could hear it right outside the fabric of the tent. There was a soft rustling, like something brushing against the nylon. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the flashlight next to my sleeping bag, my fingers trembling as I clicked it on. The light pierced the darkness inside the tent, but I didn't dare unzip the flap. I didn't want to see what was out there. I wasn't sure I could handle it. For what felt like hours, I lay there, my grip tight on the flashlight, listening as whatever was out there continued to move around the campsite. Every now and then, I heard the unmistakable sound of it stepping on branches, snapping them under its weight. At one point, it even knocked over one of the folding chairs we'd set up by the fire. I thought about waking Tim, but I didn't want to make any noise. If we stayed quiet, maybe, just maybe, it would leave us alone. Eventually the footsteps faded, the heavy breathing receding into the distance until there was nothing but the usual night sounds again. I lay there, still tense, still listening, but the creature, whatever it was, didn't return. The next morning, Tim was oblivious. He woke up, stretched, and started making coffee like nothing had happened. I was exhausted, running on barely any sleep, my nerves still on edge. "You hear anything weird last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Tim shook his head. "Nah, man. Slept like a rock. Why, did something happen?" I considered telling him about the footsteps, about the breathing right outside the tent, but something stopped me. Maybe it was embarrassment, or maybe it was the fear of sounding crazy. Instead, I just shook my head. "Nah, must have been my imagination." We spent most of that day hiking, exploring the trails near our camp. I tried to focus on the beauty of the wilderness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The forest felt off, too quiet, too still. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no signs of life. When we got back to camp in the late afternoon, I noticed something immediately. The folding chair that had been knocked over in the night wasn't just tipped, it was bent. One of the metal legs had been twisted at an angle, as if something impossibly strong had gripped it. I crouched down, running my fingers over the cold metal. "Tim, look at this." He walked over, frowning as he inspected the chair. "Huh? Weird? Maybe it just broke?" But I knew better. Chairs didn't just break like that. Something, or someone, had done this. That night, as we sat around the fire again, the tension between us was palpable. Tim tried to make conversation, but I could tell he felt it too, the unease, the sense that we weren't alone. Then, just as the last light of the day faded, we heard it again. The footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, coming from the trees, just beyond the firelight. Tim went pale, his hand tightening around his beer can. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The footsteps circled us, just like the night before, staying just out of sight, just beyond the reach of the fire. And then the breathing started again, low, ragged, like something massive, lurking just out of view. Tim stood up, grabbing the flashlight, his hands trembling. "I'm going to see what it is." "No," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "Don't. We need to stay here." But he didn't listen. He took a few steps toward the darkness, his flashlight beam cutting through the trees, and that's when we saw it, a shadow, massive, hulking, just beyond the firelight. It didn't look human. Story 5. I've been an avid hiker for 20 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in the Adirondacks last fall. My name is Tom Reeves, and this is the story of how a simple father-son camping trip turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. It was supposed to be a bonding experience with my 12-year-old son, Jake. He'd been glued to his video games all summer, and I figured a weekend in the wilderness would do us both some good. Little did I know it would test our survival skills and our sanity in ways I never imagined. We set out early on a crisp Saturday morning, the fall colors painting the landscape in vibrant reds and golds. Jake was reluctant at first, but as we hiked deeper into the forest, I saw a spark of interest in his eyes. He started asking questions about the trees, the birds, the animal tracks we spotted. For the first time in months, we were really talking. The trouble started around mid-afternoon. We'd veered off the main trail to explore a promising fishing spot I'd heard about. In hindsight, it was a rookie mistake. The unmarked path quickly became overgrown, and before I knew it, we were bushwhacking through dense underbrush. "Dad, are you sure this is the right way?" Jake's voice had an edge of worry. I tried to sound confident. "Of course, buddy. Just a little further." But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, that confidence wavered. The trees all looked the same, and my usually reliable sense of direction was failing me. We were lost, and night was falling fast. "Okay, Jake," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "We're going to set up camp here for the night. In the morning we'll find our way back. It'll be an adventure, right?" Jake nodded, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We quickly set up our small tent and gathered firewood. As darkness settled around us, I tried to keep Jake's spirits up with stories and jokes, but the forest seemed to press in on us, full of unfamiliar sounds. That's when we heard it, a long, mournful howl that echoed through the trees. It wasn't like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. There was something off about it, almost human, but not quite. "What was that, Dad?" Jake whispered, scooting closer to me by the fire. "Probably just a coyote," I said, but I didn't believe it. The howl came again, closer this time. Jake grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with fear. I tried to rationalize it. We were tired, lost, our minds playing tricks on us. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew stranger, twigs snapping just beyond the firelight, heavy breathing that didn't seem to come from any animal I knew, and always that eerie howl circling our camp. Sleep was impossible. We huddled in the tent, jumping at every sound. Around midnight I saw it, a pair of eyes reflecting our dying fire. They were too high off the ground to be a bear or a deer, and they were watching us. "Jake," I whispered, "don't move." He followed my gaze and stifled a scream. The eyes blinked, and for a moment I saw the outline of something tall and bipedal. Then it was gone, melting into the darkness with unnatural silence. We spent the rest of the night in terrified silence, clinging to each other in the tent. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, we packed up camp and started moving. I had no idea which direction to go, but anywhere seemed better than staying put. We stumbled through the underbrush, the morning mist clinging to the trees and obscuring our vision. That's when we saw the cave. It was set into a small hillside, barely visible behind a curtain of vines. Under normal circumstances, I would have steered clear, but we were exhausted, scared, and those strange howls still echoed in the distance. The cave seemed like shelter, a place to regroup and figure out our next move. "Stay close," I told Jake as we approached the entrance. The cave was surprisingly deep, the air inside cool and damp. As our eyes adjusted to the gloom, I froze. The walls were covered in claw marks, deep gouges in the rock that no bear could have made. "Dad!" Jake's voice shook. "Look!" He pointed to the far wall. In the dim light, I could make out crude drawings. They looked ancient, like Native American pictographs I'd seen in museums. But these were different. They showed tall, emaciated figures with elongated limbs and antler-like protrusions from their heads. The drawings depicted these creatures hunting, devouring what looked like human figures. A chill ran down my spine. I'd heard stories of the Wendigo, a mythical creature from Algonquin folklore, but those were just campfire tales, right? A low growl from the cave entrance shattered that illusion. We whirled around to see a silhouette blocking the light. Tall, unnaturally thin, with antlers that scraped the cave ceiling. I didn't think. I just grabbed Jake and ran deeper into the cave. We stumbled through twisting passages, the creature's heavy breathing echoing behind us. The cave seemed to go on forever, a maze of stone and darkness. Finally, we burst out of another entrance, blinking in the sudden sunlight. We were on the other side of the hill, in a part of the forest I didn't recognize, but there was no time to get our bearings. That unearthly howl split the air again, closer than ever. We ran, through streams, over fallen logs, pushing through brambles that tore at our clothes and skin. I lost all sense of direction, driven only by the primal need to get away from whatever was pursuing us. As we crashed through a thicket, I saw it, a park ranger station. Relief flooded through me as we stumbled towards it, shouting for help. The next few hours were a blur. Rangers, search parties, medical checks. We told them we got lost, left out the parts about the cave drawings and the creature. Who would believe us? It wasn't until we were safely back in town that I learned the full story. A group of hikers had gone missing in that area the previous week. Search parties had found no trace of them, and there were other stories. Local legends of an ancient evil that roamed those woods, preying on the lost and unwary. We never went camping again after that. Jake threw himself back into his video games, and I didn't have the heart to argue. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside our suburban home, I catch him looking out the window with a mixture of fear and longing. I've tried to convince myself that it was all a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion, but I can't shake the memory of those eyes in the darkness, those claw marks in the cave. And sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I swear I can hear that otherworldly howl calling from the wilderness. I don't know what's really out there in the deep woods, but I do know this: the line between myth and reality is thinner than we think, and some stories are better left untold around the campfire. So if you find yourself lost in the wilderness and you hear something that doesn't quite sound like any animal you know, don't dismiss it. Don't investigate, just run, and don't look back. Because sometimes the monsters from our nightmares are all too real. Story 6. I've always loved the solitude of camping alone, but after that night in the Cascades, I'm not sure I'll ever sleep soundly in a tent again. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and some encounters leave scars that run deeper than skin. My name is Sarah, and I'm an avid hiker and nature photographer. I've spent countless nights under the stars, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that crisp autumn evening in the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest. It was late September, and I had decided to take advantage of the last few weeks of decent weather before winter set in. I'd chosen a remote spot, about a day's hike from the nearest ranger station. The area was known for its pristine beauty and abundant wildlife, perfect for the kind of shots I was after. The hike-in was uneventful, the trail winding through towering pines and past crystal-clear streams. By late afternoon, I'd reached my campsite, a small clearing nestled against a rocky outcropping. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and spent the remaining daylight scouting the area for good photo locations. As night fell, I settled in by my small campfire, enjoying a simple dinner of trail mix and dehydrated soup. The forest around me was alive with the usual nighttime sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. It was peaceful, familiar. I felt at home. I must have dozed off by the fire because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by an unusual sound. At first I couldn't place it, a sort of heavy shuffling punctuated by the snap of branches. It was close, too close for comfort. Fully alert now, I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It seemed to be circling my campsite, staying just out of sight in the darkness beyond the firelight. My heart began to race. Bear? Cougar? Neither seemed quite right. I reached for my flashlight, debating whether to investigate or retreat to my tent. Before I could decide, the sound stopped abruptly. The forest fell eerily silent, as if holding its breath. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the edge of my camp, partially obscured by a large pine, stood a figure. In the dim light I could make out that it was tall, impossibly tall, and covered in what looked like shaggy fur. It stood on two legs, its posture unmistakably bipedal, yet there was nothing human about its proportions. I froze, the flashlight slipping from my suddenly numb fingers. Time seemed to stand still as I stared at the creature, and it stared back at me. Its eyes caught the firelight, reflecting an eerie reddish glow. In that moment, every story I'd ever heard about Bigfoot, every blurry photo or shaky video I'd dismissed as a hoax, came flooding back. But this was no man in a suit. The intelligence in those eyes, the way it moved with a fluid grace that belied its size, this was something else entirely. The creature took a step forward, emerging further from the shadows. I could see now that it stood at least 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders and powerful build making it look like a bizarre cross between a man and a bear. Its face was oddly flat, with a pronounced brow and a wide, almost lipless mouth. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but fear had me rooted to the spot. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. The creature tilted its head, regarding me with what seemed like curiosity. Then slowly, it raised one massive hair-covered hand and pointed directly at me. That broke the spell. With a strangled cry, I scrambled backwards, nearly falling over in my haste to get to my tent. I all but dove inside, fumbling with shaking hands to close the zipper. Once inside, I curled up in my sleeping bag, trying to make myself as small as possible. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I strained my ears, listening for any sound of the creature approaching. For what felt like hours, I lay there, every muscle tense, expecting at any moment to feel those massive hands tearing through the thin fabric of my tent. But nothing happened. The only sounds were the fading crackle of my neglected fire and the pounding of my own heart. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I must have drifted into a fitful sleep. I dreamed of being chased through endless dark forests, always with the sense of something huge and terrifying just behind me. I awoke with a start as the first light of dawn filtered through the tent fabric. For a moment I was disoriented, the events of the night before feeling like a particularly vivid nightmare. But as I became fully awake, the memory of what I'd seen came flooding back. It took every ounce of courage I had to unzip the tent and peer outside. The clearing looked peaceful in the early morning light, my campfire now just a pile of cold ashes. There was no sign of the creature. I was about to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, circling my entire campsite, were a series of enormous footprints. On shaky legs, I approached the nearest print. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The track was deep, suggesting whatever made it was incredibly heavy. I followed the trail of prints with my eyes, realizing with growing horror that they formed a complete circle around my camp. The creature had paced around me all night while I cowered in my tent. I grabbed my camera and began documenting everything, my hands still trembling as I snapped photo after photo. Part of me was excited at the prospect of finally having proof of something that had been relegated to the realm of myth and legend. But a larger part was simply terrified, wanting nothing more than to pack up and get as far away from this place as possible. As I photographed the last of the prints, I noticed something else. Leading away from the campsite was another set of tracks, heading deeper into the forest. Without really thinking about what I was doing, I began to follow them. The trail led me through dense underbrush and over fallen logs. Occasionally, I'd spot tufts of coarse, dark hair snagged on branches. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The forest seemed different somehow, older and wilder than it had the day before. After about half a mile, I came to a small clearing. The tracks led right up to the base of a massive, gnarled old pine tree, and there, carved into the trunk at a height that made me dizzy to contemplate, was a series of deep gouges, claw marks, too big and too high to have been made by any known animal. I stood there, staring up at those marks, feeling very small and very vulnerable. The weight of what I'd experienced, of what I now knew existed in the world, settled over me like a heavy blanket. In that moment, I made a decision. I took one last photo of the claw marks, then turned and headed back to my camp. I packed up in record time, my eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me flinching. The hike back to civilization was a blur of paranoia and adrenaline. I kept expecting to see that massive, fur-covered figure step out from behind a tree. But nothing happened. I made it back to my car without incident, though I didn't fully relax until I was miles away on the highway. In the days that followed, I wrestled with what to do with my experience and the evidence I'd gathered. Part of me wanted to share it with the world, to finally prove that these creatures exist. But another part, a part that remembered the intelligence in those eyes and the way it had simply watched me instead of attacking, held me back. In the end, I decided to keep the encounter to myself. I hid away the photos and my detailed notes, telling myself I'd decide what to do with them someday. But deep down, I knew I'd probably never share them, because now I understand something that perhaps few others do, that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that maybe we're not meant to fully understand, and sometimes the most respectful thing we can do is to let them keep their secrets. I still go camping and hiking. I still love the wilderness. But now, when night falls and the forest grows dark, I listen a little more carefully to the sounds around me, and sometimes, when the wind is right and the moon is full, I think I hear something moving out there in the shadows. Something big, something ancient, something that reminds me that we're not alone in this world, not by a long shot. Story 7. There are some places in the wild that make you feel like you shouldn't be there, like the land itself is holding its breath, waiting for you to leave. The gorge was one of those places. I had been to hundreds of remote spots before, but the moment I stepped into that canyon, I could feel it. The silence wasn't natural. It was thick, oppressive, as if the earth was hiding a secret it didn't want me to uncover. It started out as a typical photography trip, though this time I was looking for something specific, something rare. I had heard rumors about a place deep in the mountains, a gorge that was said to hold some of the most untouched beauty in the region, hidden waterfalls, dense foliage, and wildlife that hadn't been disturbed by human hands in decades. Perfect for my next project. I'm not one to turn down a challenge, so I packed my gear, drove 3 hours into the wilderness, then hiked another 6 miles off trail to get there. The trail was nearly non-existent, overgrown with thick underbrush and snaking roots. Even with my GPS, it was hard to keep my bearings, but when I finally reached the entrance to the gorge, I could see why it was so isolated. The walls were steep, almost vertical, and the only way in was through a narrow passage that was easy to miss if you didn't know where to look. standing there at the edge, looking down into the shadows. I couldn't help but hesitate. Something about the air felt heavier down here, thicker, like the canyon itself was different from the forest above. I shook it off as nerves. I had been out in places like this before, and the quiet isolation always made me uneasy at first. But once I was down there with my camera, everything would settle, or at least that's what I told myself. The descent was steep, but manageable. As I made my way down, the shadows of the gorge walls grew taller, swallowing the light as the sky overhead shrank to a thin strip. The air was cooler down here, and the sound of my boots crunching over the rocky path echoed unnervingly off the stone. Even the birds, which had chirped endlessly in the forest above, had gone silent. It was just me now, and something else. Though I couldn't see it yet, I could feel it. Once I reached the bottom, the scenery opened up into something incredible. The gorge was narrower than I expected, with moss-covered cliffs rising on either side and a thin river cutting through the middle. The sound of rushing water filled the space, but it wasn't loud enough to drown out the feeling of the unnatural quiet that hung over everything else. I set up my tripod by the river, capturing the way the sunlight filtered down through the canopy above, casting fractured beams of light that danced off the water. The place was beautiful, no doubt about it, but something about it still felt wrong. My instincts were screaming at me to stay alert, that this place wasn't safe. But again, I shrugged it off. As the day wore on, I moved further into the gorge, exploring the terrain and taking photos of the untouched wilderness. I should have been relaxed. This was exactly what I came here for, after all. But the further I went, the more on edge I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by a person. No, this was different. This felt primal. After about an hour of hiking along the river, I came across the first sign that something was wrong. It was subtle at first, a strange disturbance in the underbrush. Several large bushes were flattened, as if something massive had trampled through them. I crouched down, examining the area, but I couldn't make sense of the tracks. They weren't like anything I had seen before. Large impressions in the soft earth, deep and spaced far apart, like a creature walking on two legs. No paw prints, no hooves, just huge, deep impressions. I felt a chill run down my spine. I stood up slowly, scanning the area. There was no movement, no sound, but the air felt heavier now, as if something was lingering just out of sight, watching. I debated turning back, but I had come this far, and the light was perfect for photography. Besides, I had seen strange tracks in the wilderness before, bears maybe, or something dragging a fallen tree. It didn't mean anything. I pressed on. Not long after, I found the carcass. At first I smelled it, rotting flesh, thick and sour in the still air. The stench was overwhelming, and I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. When I pushed through the underbrush and saw it, I froze. It was a deer, or at least what was left of one. Its body was mangled, torn apart in a way that didn't make sense. Something had ripped it to shreds, but not in the way a predator normally would. It wasn't eaten. It was destroyed. Limbs twisted at unnatural angles, chunks of flesh missing, the bones cracked open and scattered around like someone had been playing with them. The worst part was the head. It was missing, cleanly removed, as if it had been cut off and taken. I stared at the scene for a long time, my stomach churning. My mind raced through possibilities, but none of them fit. I had seen animal kills before, wolves, bears, even scavengers like coyotes. But this was different. This was rage. I stood up slowly, backing away from the carcass, my camera forgotten. My heart was racing, and for the first time I seriously considered leaving. Whatever had done this wasn't something I wanted to meet, but as I turned to head back, I heard it, a low, guttural growl, not loud, but deep enough to vibrate through the air and into my chest. It was coming from behind me, somewhere in the thick brush. My blood ran cold, and I froze, heart pounding in my throat. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I just listened. Another growl, closer this time, low, dangerous, like a warning. I slowly turned my head, scanning the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The gorge was thick with shadows, and the light was fading fast, but I could feel it. Something was out there, something big, and it was watching me. I took a step backward, careful not to make any sudden movements. My mind raced, trying to remember the way I had come in, trying to think of a plan. Whatever was out there, I needed to leave. Now. But as I started to move, I heard it again, the sound of something massive moving through the brush. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, slow and methodical. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, just beyond the tree line, stalking me. I forced myself to stay calm, to focus. Running would only make things worse. I needed to get out of the gorge, back to higher ground where I could see it coming. I moved carefully, keeping my eyes on the trees, listening for any sound, any movement. The footsteps followed me, always just out of sight, just beyond the trees, but never close enough for me to see what it was. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the mouth of the gorge. The walls sloped upward, and the thin strip of sky above widened as I moved toward the entrance. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept my pace steady, refusing to let fear take over. I didn't stop until I reached the clearing where I had first entered the gorge. Only then did I allow myself to turn around, to look back. The trees stood still, the shadows long and creeping as the sun dipped lower in the sky. There was no sign of movement, no sound of footsteps. But the feeling didn't leave. I could still feel it, watching, waiting. I didn't take any more pictures that day. I packed up my gear in silence, my hands trembling as I shoved everything into my bag. The beauty of the gorge, the reason I had come in the first place, had been replaced by a deep, gnawing fear that I couldn't shake. As I hiked back up the steep trail, the weight of the silence grew heavier with each step. It wasn't until I was back in the safety of my truck, miles away from that cursed place, that I let myself breathe. But even now, as I sit here staring at the photos I took, beautiful, untouched images of the wild, I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, something that didn't want me to see what I saw, something that's still waiting in the gorge, watching and hunting. Story 8. I've captured countless images of nature's wonders, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of the Olympic National Forest. My name is Ryan Blackwood, and this is the story of how a routine wildlife photography expedition turned into a brush with the impossible. As a veteran nature photographer, I thought I'd seen it all. Grizzlies in Alaska, jaguars in the Amazon, even the elusive snow leopard in the Himalayas. But it was in my own backyard, so to speak, where I captured something that defied explanation and shook my understanding of the natural world to its core. It was late September when I ventured into the heart of the Olympic National Forest. The autumn colors were just beginning to paint the landscape, and I was hoping to catch some shots of Roosevelt elk in their natural habitat. I'd heard rumors of an unusually large herd in the area, and the thought of capturing them against the backdrop of fall foliage was too tempting to resist. I set up my base camp in a small clearing, far off the beaten path. It was the kind of spot that took years of experience to find, secluded enough to avoid human interference, but positioned perfectly for wildlife to pass through. As I unpacked my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed unusually quiet, the typical rustling and chirping conspicuously absent. "Just your imagination, Ryan," I muttered to myself, setting up my first camera trap. I'd brought my best equipment for this trip, high-resolution cameras with motion sensors, night vision capabilities, the works. If there was something out there to photograph, I was going to catch it. The first couple of days were uneventful. I got some nice shots of deer, a few black bears, even a cougar slinking through the underbrush at dawn. But no sign of the elk herd I'd come for. On the third night, that all changed. I was reviewing the day's footage in my tent when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It was a low, rumbling vocalization, unlike anything I'd heard before. Not quite a growl, not quite a roar. My first thought was bear, but something about the pitch and duration felt wrong. Grabbing my camera and night vision scope, I stepped out of the tent. The forest was eerily still, as if holding its breath. I scanned the tree line, my heart pounding in my ears. For a moment, nothing. Then, movement caught my eye. About 50 yards away, something large was moving through the trees. In the green glow of my night vision, I could make out a massive, bipedal figure. My mind raced through possibilities. Bear standing on its hind legs. Unusually large hiker. But as it turned, seemingly looking directly at me, I knew this was something else entirely. The figure was at least 8 feet tall, covered in what appeared to be thick, matted fur. Its arms were unnaturally long, nearly reaching the ground, and its face, God, its face, a mix of ape and man, with eyes that reflected the moonlight like a predator's. I stood frozen, my finger instinctively pressing the shutter button. The creature held my gaze for what felt like an eternity, then melted back into the darkness with surprising grace for its size. As soon as it was gone, I sprinted back to my tent, my hands shaking as I downloaded the images from my camera. Most were too blurry to make out clearly, just a dark smudge against the trees. But one image made my blood run cold. It wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. A face that shouldn't exist, eyes glowing with reflected light, staring directly into the lens. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with possibilities. Had I actually photographed a Sasquatch? The rational part of my brain rebelled against the idea, but I couldn't deny what I'd seen with my own eyes. The next morning, I decided to investigate further. Following the direction where I'd seen the creature disappear, I found a series of tracks in the soft forest floor. They were huge, easily 15 inches long, with a depth that suggested immense weight. I photographed them meticulously, placing my own boot next to them for scale. As I followed the tracks deeper into the woods, the feeling of being watched intensified. Twigs snapped in the distance. Once, I caught a whiff of a musky, almost human odor that made my nose wrinkle. I pressed on, equal parts terrified and exhilarated. The tracks led me to a small glade I hadn't noticed before. What I saw there stopped me in my tracks. The trees surrounding the clearing were bent and woven in unnatural patterns, creating what looked like crude structures. Piles of branches and foliage formed what could only be described as nests. My hands trembled as I raised my camera, documenting everything. This was far beyond anything a known animal could create. As I circled one of the structures, something caught my eye. Tucked into the woven branches was a scrap of fabric, weathered and dirty, but unmistakably man-made. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it matched the description of a hiker who had gone missing in the area months ago. A branch snapped behind me. I whirled around, coming face to face with nothing. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was out there, watching me. I'd overstayed my welcome. I hurried back to my camp, my mind reeling. Everything I thought I knew about the natural world was being challenged. I had evidence, photos, tracks, the structures. But would anyone believe me? Would I be labeled a crackpot, my reputation ruined? As I approached my tent, my heart sank. My campsite was in shambles. The tent was collapsed, my supplies scattered, and my cameras, my expensive high-tech camera traps, were gone. All of them. A wave of dread washed over me. Whatever I had encountered, it was intelligent enough to understand the threat my cameras posed. It had systematically destroyed my evidence. I salvaged what I could and got the hell out of there. The hike back to civilization was a blur, every shadow seeming to hide some primeval predator. When I finally reached my car, I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. In the end, I decided to keep quiet. I had one photo, the tracks, and my story, but without the rest of the evidence, who would believe me? I've spent the months since then poring over research, reaching out discreetly to cryptozoologists and anthropologists. I've returned to the Olympic National Forest several times, hoping to catch another glimpse, to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But the forest keeps its secrets well. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, the image of those glowing eyes burned into my memory. I find myself staring at that one blurry photo, questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I don't expect you to believe me. Hell, some days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw in those woods. I know what I photographed. And I know that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness we think we've catalogued and understood, something extraordinary still roams. So the next time you're hiking in the deep woods and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, remember my story. And remember that sometimes the most incredible discoveries are the ones we're least prepared to accept. Story 9. I've been a hunter for 30 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. But what I encountered in the mountains that day shook me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. My name's John, and I've been tracking game through the forests of northern Minnesota since I was old enough to hold a rifle. I've faced down angry bears, stalked elk through blizzards, and once had to spend 3 days holed up in a cave waiting out a freak storm. But nothing in all those years prepared me for what I saw that crisp November morning. It started like any other hunting trip. I'd driven up to my favorite spot in the Superior National Forest, a remote area that usually yielded a decent haul of deer. The first snow of the season had fallen a few days prior, leaving a pristine white blanket over the landscape. Perfect tracking conditions, I thought. I set out at dawn, my breath frosting in the cold air as I made my way into the silent forest. The world seemed muffled under the snow, my footsteps crunching loudly in the stillness. I'd been walking for about an hour when I first noticed the tracks. At first glance, they looked like deer prints, but something was off. They were too big for one thing, and the stride was all wrong. I crouched down to get a better look. My curiosity piqued. That's when I realized what I was seeing. These were bipedal tracks. My first thought was bear, but I dismissed it quickly. Bears don't walk on their hind legs for any distance, and these tracks went on as far as I could see. Plus the shape was all wrong, too narrow, with distinct toe impressions that looked almost human, but elongated and ending in what appeared to be claw marks. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I'd heard stories, of course. Every hunter has. Tales of creatures in the woods, things that shouldn't exist. But I'd always written them off as campfire tales, or the product of too much whiskey. Now, faced with these tracks, I wasn't so sure. Curiosity overrode caution, and I decided to follow the trail. The tracks led deeper into the forest, away from my usual hunting grounds. As I walked, I noticed other oddities. Branches snapped off high up on trees, claw marks on bark at a height that made me dizzy to contemplate. The forest seemed to grow denser, older, as I progressed. The trees here were giants, their branches forming a cathedral-like canopy overhead. Very little sunlight penetrated, and the temperature seemed to drop with each step I took. I'm not sure how long I'd been walking when I heard it, a sound that stopped me in my tracks. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the trees. My hand went to my rifle instinctively, but I knew in my gut that it would be useless against whatever made that sound. I scanned the forest around me, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, partially obscured by a massive pine, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. It was covered in what looked like patchy, matted fur, dark against the snow. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I had the distinct impression it was studying me as intently as I was studying it. Then, with a fluid grace that belied its size, it turned and loped off into the forest. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like hours but was probably only a few seconds. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. It couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe hypothermia setting in. But deep down, I knew what I'd witnessed was all too real. Shaking myself out of my stupor, I decided to try and follow it. I'm not sure what I was thinking. Probably wasn't thinking at all, to be honest. I just knew I couldn't let this go without trying to get another look, maybe even a photo. I set off in the direction it had gone, moving as quietly as I could through the snow. The tracks were clear, leading me deeper into this primeval part of the forest. I lost all sense of time and direction, focused solely on following that trail. After what might have been minutes or hours, I emerged into a small clearing. The tracks led right up to the edge, and then nothing. It was as if the creature had simply vanished into thin air. I scanned the area, baffled, when movement caught my eye. There, on the other side of the clearing, it stood watching me. In the open space, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was even taller than I'd first thought, easily 8 or 9 feet. Its body was emaciated, ribs clearly visible under its patchy fur. But it was the face that truly chilled me to the bone. It was vaguely human-like, but stretched and distorted. The eyes were too large, sunken deep into their sockets. The mouth was a wide, lipless gash filled with sharp teeth. As I watched, paralyzed, it opened that mouth and let out a sound, not the growl from before, but a high, keening wail that seemed to pierce right through me. That broke the spell. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for stealth or direction. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest around me was unfamiliar, the trees packed so densely that I could barely see the sky. As my breathing slowed, I became aware of the silence. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, and underneath it all, barely perceptible, was a sound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I faced whatever was coming with courage, but the truth is, I ran again. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, until I tripped over a root and went sprawling in the snow. As I lay there, waiting for the end, I heard a sound that nearly made me weep with relief, the distant rumble of a vehicle on a road. Somehow, in my blind panic, I'd run in the right direction. I staggered to my feet and made for that sound, not daring to look back. I emerged onto the road about a mile from where I'd parked my truck. I've never been so glad to see that old rust bucket in my life. I drove home in a daze, my mind still reeling from what I'd experienced. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I pored over local legends, researched cryptid sightings in the area. I found stories of the Wendigo, an emaciated, cannibalistic creature from Algonquin folklore. The descriptions matched what I'd seen all too well. I debated reporting what I'd seen, but who would believe me? I had no proof, no photos, nothing but my own rattled testimony. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself. But I did make some changes. I still hunt, still spend time in the woods. But now I stick to well-traveled areas, and I never go out alone. And on cold, clear nights when the moon is full, I sometimes think I hear that keening wail in the distance. It's a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the dark places where humans rarely tread. So if you're ever in the northern woods and you see strange tracks in the snow, my advice is this: don't follow them. Turn around, go home, and be grateful for the mundane world of cars and computers and electric lights. Because out there in the wilderness, in the deep, dark heart of the forest, there are ancient things that still roam, things that should be left alone. As for me, I'll never forget that day, or the sight of that creature watching me from across the clearing. It's a memory that haunts me still, a reminder that no matter how well we think we know nature, it will always have its secrets, and some of those secrets have teeth. Story 10. I've been exploring caves for years. There's a certain thrill in venturing into the unknown, pushing through tight spaces, squeezing through cracks that lead into chambers no one has seen in decades, maybe even centuries. But no cave had ever made me feel like I didn't belong until I found this one. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it in my bones, that overwhelming sense that I was trespassing in a place meant to stay hidden. It was supposed to be a normal trip. I had heard about a series of caves in the Rocky Mountains that hadn't been fully explored. Most people avoided the area, said it was too remote, too difficult to navigate, but that's exactly what drew me in. The harder the challenge, the more isolated the cave, the more I wanted to explore it. I had been hiking for hours, picking my way through dense forest and over rocky terrain, when I stumbled across the entrance. It was half hidden by thick underbrush, a jagged opening in the side of a rock face that looked more like a wound than a natural cave. The mouth of the cave was narrow, just wide enough for me to squeeze through, but something about it caught my eye. The air around it was cold, unnaturally so, and it seemed to pull me in, beckoning me to step inside. I should have walked away. I should have trusted that instinct that told me not to go any further, but curiosity is a dangerous thing, and it always gets the better of me. I pulled out my flashlight, clicked it on, and ducked into the cave. The light from outside quickly disappeared as I descended into the darkness. The air was thick with moisture, cool and damp, clinging to my skin like a second layer. The walls of the cave were rough, jagged, as if the earth had been torn apart by some violent force. As I moved deeper inside, the narrow passageway opened up into a larger chamber. My flashlight beam danced over the rocky walls, revealing intricate formations of stalactites and stalagmites that had grown over centuries. The cave was beautiful in its own way, untouched, ancient, a world frozen in time. But something was off. The deeper I went, the more I felt it, that weight pressing down on me, the sense that I wasn't supposed to be here. It wasn't just the darkness or the isolation. It was something more, something primal. I stopped for a moment, listening. My own breathing echoed softly off the stone walls. But beyond that, nothing. No dripping water, no distant rustling of animals, nothing. Just silence. I moved on, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I navigated through a series of narrow tunnels, I noticed the temperature dropping even further. The cold bit at my skin, and my breath came out in visible puffs, despite it being summer outside. It didn't make sense. The further I went, the colder it got, and with each step, that sense of unease grew stronger. About an hour in, I found something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The tunnel I had been following opened into another chamber, but this one was different. The floor was scattered with bones, animal bones by the looks of it, deer maybe, or smaller mammals. But they weren't just lying there randomly. They had been arranged in strange patterns, almost like symbols or circles. Some of the bones were shattered, others worn smooth, as if they had been handled over and over again. My heart pounded in my chest as I knelt down, examining one of the patterns. It didn't make sense. I had never seen anything like it. What the hell would drag bones this deep into a cave and then arrange them like this? I straightened up, my skin crawling. That feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. I shone my flashlight around the chamber, but nothing moved. The walls were jagged and close, the ceiling looming overhead like it was ready to collapse at any moment. The air was heavy, stale, pressing in on me from all sides. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to climb back out of the cave and never come back. But something, some part of me that I didn't understand, kept me rooted to the spot. I had to see more. I had to know what was deeper inside. I moved further into the cave, stepping over the bones, and squeezed through another narrow passageway. The walls closed in, scraping against my shoulders as I crawled on hands and knees through the tight space. My flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the rock. Then I heard it. At first I thought it was just the sound of my own movement, rocks shifting under my weight, my boots scuffing against the stone floor. But then it came again. A soft, distant sound, like something scraping against rock. Slow, deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. Something was moving in the dark. I swept my flashlight around, the beam bouncing off the slick walls of the tunnel. My pulse raced, but I couldn't see anything. The sound had stopped. The cave was silent again, but the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. I tried to push the fear down, telling myself it was just the wind, maybe an animal that had wandered in and was now just as lost as I was. But in the back of my mind I knew better. The patterns in the bones, the cold. None of this was natural. I should have turned back. I should have left right then and there. But I was in too deep, both literally and figuratively. I kept moving slowly, cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. The tunnel began to widen again, and soon I found myself in another chamber. This one was different from the others. The walls were smoother, almost polished, and the floor was free of debris or rockfall. In the center of the chamber was a small pool of water. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like a mirror. I approached it slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There was something wrong about this place, something unnatural. As I reached the edge of the pool, I noticed something glinting just beneath the surface. I crouched down, shining my light into the water, and then I saw it. There were more bones, submerged just beneath the clear water. Human bones. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. What the hell was this place? What had happened here? My thoughts raced, but before I could process what I was seeing, the sound came again. This time, it was unmistakable. A low, scraping noise, like something large dragging itself across the stone, and it was coming from the tunnel behind me. I whipped around, shining my flashlight toward the entrance to the chamber. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows against the walls. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it, something moving in the darkness, slow, deliberate, getting closer with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But I was frozen, caught between the urge to flee and the need to understand what the hell was stalking me. Then I saw it. A shadow at the edge of my flashlight beam, just at the mouth of the tunnel. It was massive, hunched over, and moving in a way that sent a jolt of pure, primal fear through me. I couldn't make out any details, just the hulking form, the way it seemed to glide along the ground, like it wasn't even touching the stone. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, my heart slamming against my ribs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stumbled through the tunnel, the walls closing in on me, scraping my arms and legs as I scrambled to get away. Behind me I could hear it, whatever it was, picking up speed, its movements faster now, more determined. The tunnel felt longer than before, like the walls were shifting, twisting, trying to trap me inside. My flashlight flickered again, and for a terrifying moment I was plunged into darkness, but then the light came back on, and I saw the faint glow of the cave's entrance ahead. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I burst out of the cave and into the fading daylight, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for air. I looked back at the cave entrance, expecting to see something, anything, emerge from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the yawning black hole of the cave, silent and still. I didn't stick around to find out if it would follow me. I grabbed my gear, and without looking back, I made my way out of the forest as fast as I could. I've explored caves all over the world, but I've never gone back to that one, and I never will. Story 11. I've been hunting these woods for 30 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that fateful winter morning. My name is David Larson, and this is the story of how I became the prey. The first snow of the season had blanketed the Cascade Mountains, transforming the landscape into a winter wonderland. It was perfect tracking weather, and I was eager to fill my elk tag before the season ended. I'd heard rumors of a massive bull in the area, and the thought of bagging a record breaker had me up before dawn, my trusted rifle slung over my shoulder. The crisp mountain air bit at my face as I made my way deeper into the forest. Fresh powder crunched beneath my boots, and my breath came out in steamy puffs. It was the kind of silence you only find in a snow-covered forest. Deep, almost reverent. About 2 hours into my trek, I spotted the first tracks. My heart raced with excitement as I knelt to examine them. But something was off. These weren't elk tracks, at least not like any I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of a normal elk print, and there was something strange about the gait. Curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow the trail, my hunter's instinct overriding the small voice of caution in the back of my mind. The tracks led me off my planned route, deeper into a part of the forest I'd never explored before. As I pushed through a dense thicket, the trees suddenly opened up into a small clearing. What I saw there made me stop dead in my tracks. In the center of the clearing lay the carcass of a bull elk, and not just any elk. This was the biggest I'd ever seen, easily a 400-pounder. But it was the state of the carcass that turned my blood to ice. The animal had been torn apart, its massive body rent by forces that no normal predator could muster. The snow around it was stained crimson, and great chunks of flesh had been ripped away. This wasn't the work of wolves or a mountain lion. The violence of the scene spoke of something far more powerful and far less natural. I approached cautiously, my rifle at the ready. The elk's glassy eyes stared vacantly at the grey sky, its massive antlers half buried in the blood-stained snow. As I circled the carcass, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Among the animal's prints in the snow were others, huge bipedal tracks that looked almost human, but far too large and with the impression of massive claws at the ends of the toes. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest had gone deathly quiet. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an oppressive, waiting silence. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion. It was something primal, something that spoke to the most ancient part of my brain and screamed one word: predator. I raised my rifle, scanning the tree line. My hands were shaking, and I forced myself to take deep breaths. "Get a grip, David," I muttered to myself. "There's a logical explanation for this." But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Whatever had killed that elk and made those tracks was beyond my understanding of the natural world. Movement caught my eye, a flash of dark fur between the trees. I pivoted, trying to track it, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The growl came again, closer this time, and with it came a smell, a musky, almost human odor that turned my stomach. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare off whatever was out there. The gunshot echoed through the mountains, and for a moment, silence reigned. Then, from just behind me, came a roar that shook me to my very core. I ran. All thoughts of hunting, of tracking, of logic flew out the window as pure animal panic took over. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning in the cold air. Behind me, I could hear something giving chase. Something big, moving with a speed that defied belief. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I fled through the snow-covered forest. At some point, I realized I'd dropped my rifle, but going back for it wasn't an option. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and whatever was pursuing me. As I burst through a stand of pines, my foot caught on a hidden root. I went down hard, tumbling down a small embankment. Pain shot through my ankle as I tried to stand, sprained, maybe broken. I dragged myself behind a fallen log, trying to catch my breath and figure out my next move. The forest had gone quiet again, but I knew it was out there, watching, waiting. I could feel its eyes on me, hear its heavy breathing somewhere in the shadows. I was no longer the hunter. I was the prey. As the realization sank in, a strange calm came over me. If this was how it ended, I'd face it with dignity. I'd lived my life in these woods, and if they were to claim me, so be it. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of approaching footsteps in the snow. But the killing blow never came. Instead, I heard a snuffling sound, like some enormous creature scenting the air. Then, to my utter disbelief, a grunt that sounded almost disappointed. The footsteps receded, fading into the distance until all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I don't know how long I stayed there, huddled behind that log. It wasn't until the winter sun began to dip below the mountains that I finally found the courage to move. My ankles screamed in protest as I limped through the gathering darkness, using a broken branch as a makeshift crutch. By some miracle, I made it back to my truck just as full night was falling. I cranked the heat, my whole body shaking with cold and lingering terror. As I drove down the mountain, my mind raced. What had I encountered out there? Some unknown species? A creature of legend come to life? Or had fear and isolation played tricks on my senses? I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? A seasoned hunter running from shadows in the woods. I'd be laughed out of every bar in the county, but I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness we think we've tamed, something ancient and unknowable still roams. I gave up hunting after that day, sold my guns, hung up my camo. These days, I stick to fishing in well-populated lakes, but sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind howls outside my cabin, I find myself staring out at the dark woods, and I swear just for a moment I can see a pair of eyes staring back, ancient, intelligent, and hungry. So the next time you're in the wilderness and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, remember my story. Remember that in the great wild places of the world, we are not always at the top of the food chain, and sometimes the hunter can become the hunted in the blink of an eye. Story 12. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but the photo I captured that day in the Ozarks left me speechless. Some images can't be explained away, and some encounters change you forever. This is the story of the day I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. My name is Mark, and I've been a wildlife photographer for the better part of 2 decades. I've trekked through jungles, crawled across tundras, and scaled mountains in search of the perfect shot. But it was in the familiar woods of my home state that I encountered something that defied explanation and shook my understanding of the natural world to its core. It was a crisp October morning when I set out into the Mark Twain National Forest. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the landscape in a riot of reds and golds. I'd heard rumors of an unusual wolf pack in the area, and I was hoping to catch them on film. Little did I know, I was about to photograph something far stranger than wolves. I'd been hiking for a few hours, my camera gear a comfortable weight on my back, when I found a promising spot near a small clearing. I set up my blind, settled in, and prepared for a long wait. That's often the nature of wildlife photography, hours of patience punctuated by moments of frantic activity. As the day wore on, I occupied myself by taking shots of the local bird life and some deer that wandered through. The light was starting to fade, taking on that golden quality that photographers dream about, when I heard it, a howl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't like any wolf howl I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality to it. I raised my camera, heart pounding with excitement and a touch of fear. That's when I saw it emerge from the tree line. At first glance, it looked like a wolf, but as it moved into the clearing, I realized it was far too big. It stood easily as tall as a man at the shoulder, its fur a mottled grey and brown. But it was the way it moved that really caught my attention. It walked on all fours, but there was something off about its gait, almost as if it wasn't quite comfortable on four legs. I started snapping photos frantically, my training taking over despite my shock. Through the zoom lens, I could see details that made my blood run cold. Its front paws looked almost like hands, with opposable thumbs, and its face, God, its face. It was a bizarre mix of wolf and human features, with eyes that held an intelligence that was anything but animal. As I watched, frozen behind my camera, the creature stopped and stood upright on its hind legs. It towered over the underbrush, easily 8 feet tall. It lifted its head and let out another of those bone-chilling howls. That's when it turned and looked directly at me. I don't know if it could smell me or if it somehow sensed the camera, but in that moment, our eyes met through the lens. I saw recognition there, and something else, a warning perhaps, or a challenge. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I kept shooting and captured the photo of a lifetime. But the truth is, in that moment, every instinct I had screamed at me to run. I scrambled out of my blind, leaving most of my gear behind, and ran like I've never run before. I didn't stop until I reached my car, parked miles away at the trailhead. As I sat there, hands shaking on the steering wheel, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. It couldn't have been real. Maybe it was an elaborate hoax, or a hallucination brought on by dehydration or fatigue. But deep down, I knew what I'd witnessed was all too real. It took me a few days to work up the courage to look at the photos I'd taken. Most of them were what you'd expect, birds, deer, the usual forest scenes. But then I came to the last few shots, and my breath caught in my throat. There it was, in vivid digital clarity, the creature caught mid-transformation as it rose to its hind legs. The photos weren't perfect, there was some motion blur and the light was fading, but they were clear enough to see the impossible blend of wolf and human features, the intelligence in those eyes, the sheer size of the thing against the surrounding trees. I stared at those photos for hours, alternating between excitement at having captured something truly extraordinary and gut-wrenching fear at the implications of what I'd seen. What was this creature? How could it exist without the world knowing? And what would happen if I shared these photos? In the end, I decided to keep them to myself, at least for the time being. I've heard too many stories of careers ruined by claims of cryptid sightings, of lives turned upside down by unwanted attention from believers and skeptics alike. Plus, a part of me felt that revealing the creature's existence would be a betrayal somehow. Those eyes had held too much intelligence, too much awareness, for me to expose it to the world without its consent. But the encounter changed me. I still go out into the woods, still take my photos, but now I do it with a newfound respect and caution. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush makes me wonder what might be out there watching. I've done research since that day, diving into local legends and folklore. I've found stories of skinwalkers and wendigos, of shapeshifters that blur the line between man and beast. None of them quite match what I saw, but they all point to a world that's stranger and more mysterious than most of us realize. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I think I hear that howl again, drifting on the wind from the deep woods. It's a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist in the shadows of our understanding. I still have those photos, locked away in a secure hard drive. Sometimes I take them out and look at them, half expecting them to have vanished or changed. But they're always the same. A frozen moment of impossibility, a glimpse into a world beyond our everyday experience. I don't know if I'll ever see that creature again. Part of me hopes I do, while another part dreads the possibility. But I do know that I'll never look at the woods the same way again. Every time I raise my camera now, there's a moment of anticipation, a wonder at what might appear in the frame. Because now I know that the world is bigger, stranger, and more wonderful than we can imagine. There are things out there that don't fit neatly into our categories of real and imaginary. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, or perhaps very unlucky, we might catch a glimpse of them through our lenses. So the next time you're out in the wild places of the world, pay attention. Look closely at the shadows between the trees. Listen for the sounds that don't quite fit. You never know what you might discover. Just remember, some discoveries come with a price. Once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back to blissful ignorance. As for me, I'll keep taking my photos, keep exploring the wilderness. But now I do it with a new perspective, always aware that I might not be the only one watching through a lens. In this vast, mysterious world of ours, sometimes we're the observers, and sometimes we're the observed. Story 13. I've spent my life in forests. There's something about the solitude of the woods that's always felt like home to me. But there are places even someone like me knows better than to enter. Places where the trees seem to lean in just a little too close, where the wind doesn't rustle through the leaves but whispers something darker. When I was assigned to patrol the forbidden area of the national park, I laughed it off. I thought the stories were just that, stories. I was wrong. It wasn't an official forbidden zone, but the locals called it that. An area deep in the park that no one really talked about. No trails led there, and the older rangers warned the new recruits to stay clear, citing dangerous terrain and unpredictable wildlife. But the way they said it, their voices low, eyes darting to the ground, made it clear there was something more, something unspoken. That's why I was surprised when Dan, my supervisor, called me in one morning and told me I'd be patrolling that area for the next few weeks. He was vague about the details, only mentioning that there had been reports of strange animal activity and that they needed someone experienced to check it out. "You're one of our best, Josh," he said, with a hint of something I couldn't quite place in his voice. "Just make sure you stay alert." I brushed off the weird vibe, packed my gear, and set off that same day. I'd been through worse terrain. What could possibly be out there that I hadn't already encountered? The drive out was long, and the further I went, the less familiar the park became. Trees grew denser, their trunks wider, their branches thick and gnarled. The canopy overhead was so thick that only slivers of sunlight filtered through, casting long, shifting shadows on the forest floor. Even the air felt different, heavier, as though the woods themselves were pressing down on me. I parked my truck at the edge of the marked territory, where the official trails ended, and started walking. The first few miles were uneventful, the usual sights and sounds of the wilderness accompanying me. Birds chirped high above, squirrels darted across my path, and the wind rustled through the trees. But as the hours passed and I ventured deeper, things began to change. The first sign was the quiet. I didn't notice it at first, too focused on the path ahead. But eventually, the absence of sound became impossible to ignore. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. It was as if the forest itself had gone still, holding its breath. My footsteps, which had been muffled by the soft earth, now seemed to echo in the eerie silence. I stopped and listened, hoping to hear something, anything, that would break the tension hanging in the air. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive quiet and the sound of my own breathing. That's when I saw the trees, At first glance, they looked like any other trees, tall, ancient, their bark rough and covered in moss. But as I moved closer, I realized there was something wrong. The bark was scarred, deep gouges running in jagged lines up and down the trunks. The markings were high, too high for any animal I knew to make. I ran my fingers over one of the gouges, feeling the rough, splintered edges. It wasn't natural. I took a few steps back, scanning the forest around me. The trees stretched on in every direction, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was hiding just out of sight, lurking in the shadows between the trees. The radio at my hip crackled, pulling me from my thoughts. "Josh, you there?" It was Dan's voice, distorted by static. I grabbed the radio. "Yeah, I'm here. Just found something strange. These trees have marks on them. Big ones." "Animal activity," Dan replied quickly, almost too quickly. "Probably just a bear. Stay cautious." I frowned, staring at the deep gashes again. I'd seen bear markings before, and this didn't look like that. But I didn't argue. Roger that. Still, the unease lingered. As I continued walking, the markings grew more frequent. Whole swaths of trees had been gouged, their bark torn and shredded. And then I noticed something else. Footprints. Huge, deep prints in the soft earth, far larger than any human footprint. The tracks were spaced apart in a way that suggested whatever had made them was walking on two legs. I crouched down, studying them, my heart beginning to race. They were fresh, very fresh. I stood up quickly, glancing around. The forest felt different now, more hostile, more oppressive. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound anymore. It felt alive, like the woods themselves were watching me. I kept moving, trying to push the growing fear aside. But as the day wore on, the feeling of being followed became impossible to ignore. Every time I stopped, I thought I could hear it. A soft rustling behind me, the faintest sound of branches snapping underfoot. But every time I turned, there was nothing there, just the trees, the shadows, and the thick, suffocating silence. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden light through the trees, when I came to a small clearing. It was here that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing, arranged in a rough circle, were bones. Not animal bones, but human ones. They were old, the bones yellowed with age, but there was no mistaking what they were. Skulls, femurs, ribs, all laid out in a grotesque display. Some had been cracked open, as if gnawed on by something with immense strength. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. What the hell was this? My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I grabbed my radio, my hand trembling as I pressed the button. "Dan, I found something. Human remains, a lot of them. What the hell is going on out here?" There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment I thought I'd lost the signal. Then Dan's voice crackled through, low and tense. "Josh, you need to leave, now." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What the hell is this? You sent me out here knowing something was wrong, didn't you?" "Josh, I can't explain right now. Just get out of there. Don't stop. Don't look back." I stared at the radio, my heart pounding. Something in Dan's voice terrified me more than the bones at my feet. It wasn't just fear, it was guilt. But before I could respond, the rustling sound came again, louder this time, close, too close. I spun around, my flashlight flicking through the trees. For a moment, I saw nothing but the darkening forest. But then, just at the edge of the clearing, something moved. A shadow, tall and hulking, slipping between the trees. It was big, bigger than any man or animal I'd ever seen, and it was watching me. My breath hitched in my throat as I backed away, my pulse roaring in my ears. The figure stepped forward, and I caught a glimpse of it in the fading light, a massive bipedal shape, covered in dark, matted fur. Its eyes glinted in the shadows, cold and predatory. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted through the forest, my feet pounding against the uneven ground. Behind me, I could hear it, heavy footfalls crashing through the underbrush, closing in fast. Whatever it was bigger, faster, and it wasn't stopping. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs aching, but the thing was relentless. I could feel its presence behind me, the weight of its gaze pressing down on me like a physical force. I didn't dare look back. The trees blurred past me as I ran, my mind a blur of terror and confusion. What the hell was that thing? How had it stayed hidden for so long? And why had Dan sent me here knowing it was out there? I burst through the tree line and saw my truck ahead, parked just where I'd left it. The sight of it was like a lifeline, pulling me forward even as the thing behind me drew closer. I could hear its ragged breathing now, feel the vibrations of its footsteps shaking the ground beneath me. I reached the truck, fumbling for my keys with trembling hands. Behind me, the thing let out a low, guttural growl, the sound vibrating through the air like a threat. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut, just as something heavy slammed into the side of the truck with enough force to rock it on its wheels. I didn't look. I couldn't. My hands shook as I shoved the key into the ignition, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, tearing down the dirt road, away from whatever was hunting me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the forest a distant shadow in my rearview mirror. Only then did I pull over, my hands still shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I never went back to that part of the park again. Story 14. I've explored caves all over the world, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of the Ozark Mountains. My name is Mark Sullivan, and this is the story of how a routine spelunking expedition turned into a fight for survival against something that shouldn't exist. It was supposed to be a simple survey of a newly discovered cave system. As an experienced caver and geologist, I'd been called in to assess its potential for further scientific study. The local caving community was buzzing with excitement. Initial reports suggested the cave might be one of the largest in the region, with possible links to underground water systems. I arrived at the cave entrance on a crisp autumn morning, my gear meticulously packed and checked. The mouth of the cave was a narrow fissure in a limestone cliff face, barely visible behind a curtain of moss and ferns. As I switched on my headlamp and ducked into the opening, I felt the familiar thrill of exploration coursing through my veins. The first few hundred meters were typical limestone cave formations, narrow passages opening into larger chambers, stalactites and stalagmites, creating a forest of stone. But as I pushed deeper, things began to change. The air grew colder, damper. The rock walls seemed to close in, creating a sense of claustrophobia I'd never experienced before. It was in a large chamber, about a kilometer into the system, that I first saw them. The paintings. At first, I thought they were just mineral stains on the walls. But as I moved closer, my headlamp illuminated unmistakable figures. Crude, yet hauntingly lifelike, they depicted humans and animals in various scenes of hunting and ritual. My heart raced with excitement. This was an unprecedented find. Cave art in a region where none had been documented before. But as I studied the images more closely, a chill ran down my spine. Among the recognizable figures were others, tall, elongated forms with bestial features and what looked like fur. "Just your imagination, Mark," I muttered, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. I snapped photos, my mind already composing the paper I'd write on this discovery. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl echoing from deeper in the cave. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't the sound of shifting rocks or running water. This was alive. Curiosity warred with caution. The rational part of my brain said to turn back, to report my findings and return with a full team. But the explorer in me couldn't resist pushing on. I had to know what was down there. The passage narrowed as I moved deeper, the ceiling lowering until I was forced to crouch. The air grew thicker, filled with a musty, almost animal scent, and always that low growl, growing louder with each step. The tunnel suddenly opened into a vast chamber, so large my headlamp couldn't illuminate the far walls. As I fumbled for my more powerful flashlight, my foot struck something on the ground. I looked down and felt my blood turn to ice. Bones, hundreds of them scattered across the cavern floor. Some were clearly animal, deer, bear, even what looked like mountain lion. But others were unmistakably human. I swept my light across the chamber, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I saw them, the paintings again, but larger, more intricate. They covered the walls, telling a story I couldn't quite comprehend. Humanoid figures worshipping or perhaps fleeing from larger, more bestial forms. And at the center of it all, a creature that defied description, part man, part wolf, with antlers like a great stag. A low growl rumbled through the chamber, closer this time, much closer. I whirled around, my light catching a flash of movement in the shadows. Something large was circling the edge of the chamber, just out of sight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" The only response was another growl, deeper and more menacing. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. My light flickered. The batteries were dying. In the fading glow, I saw something emerge from the darkness. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, covered in matted fur. Its face was a nightmare mixture of human and wolf, with antlers crowning its head like some pagan god. And its eyes, God, its eyes glowed with an intelligence that was anything but animal. I ran. Panic overrode all rational thought as I bolted for the tunnel. Behind me, I heard the creature's roar shake the very stones of the cave. I stumbled through the darkness, my dying headlamp barely illuminating the path ahead. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind me, growing closer with each passing second. I don't know how long I ran, or how I managed to navigate the twisting passages in near darkness. Adrenaline and blind terror propelled me forward, even as my lungs burned and my muscles screamed for rest. Finally, I saw it, a faint glimmer of daylight ahead. With a final burst of speed, I hurled myself towards the cave entrance. As I burst into the sunlight, I heard one last roar from the depths, filled with frustration and... was that hunger? I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I sped down the mountain road, my mind raced. What had I seen? Some unknown species? A hallucination brought on by bad air in the cave? Or something more supernatural? I never filed a report on what I found in that cave. Who would believe me? I'd be laughed out of the scientific community, my reputation in tatters. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that somewhere in the depths of those mountains, something ancient and terrible still lurks. I gave up caving after that day, sold my gear, cancelled my subscriptions to geology journals. These days I stick to surface surveys and well-lit mines. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself thinking about that cave. And I swear, just for a moment, I can hear that otherworldly growl echoing in the distance. So the next time you're hiking in the wilderness and you come across a cave mouth hidden in the rocks, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the deepest, darkest places hold secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. And sometimes the monsters from our nightmares are all too real. I often wonder if I should have told someone, warned them about what's down there. But then I think about those paintings, those ancient images of worship and fear. Whatever that creature is, it's been there for thousands of years. And maybe, just maybe, it's better left undisturbed. But I can't shake the feeling that one day it might decide to leave its underground lair. And God help us all if it does. So if you're ever in the Ozarks and you hear stories of strange howls in the night or see unusual tracks in the forest, think twice before dismissing them. Because sometimes the old legends have more truth to them than we're willing to admit. And sometimes the real monsters are the ones we've forgotten how to fear. Story 15. I've always thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand. But that day, as the sun dipped below the horizon and an unfamiliar scent filled the air, I realized how little I truly understood about the wilderness I called home. My name's Tom, and I've been hiking these Appalachian trails since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. I'm the guy friends call when they want to know the best spots for camping or where to find the most breathtaking views. But after what happened on that crisp autumn evening, I'm not sure I'll ever look at these mountains the same way again. It was supposed to be a routine day hike, just me, my backpack, and the great outdoors. I'd chosen a less traveled path, eager to explore some new terrain and maybe scout out locations for future camping trips. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with a light breeze rustling through the changing leaves. I'd been on the trail for a few hours when I first noticed something odd. The forest had gone quiet. Now, if you spend enough time in the woods, you know that silence isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's just the natural ebb and flow of forest life. But this was different. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I paused, my senses on high alert. That's when I saw the first claw marks. They were on a tree to my left, about chest height. At first glance, they looked like bear scratches. We get plenty of black bears in these parts. But something was off. They were too high, for one thing, and the spacing was all wrong. Whatever made these marks had fingers, not paws. A chill ran down my spine as I examined the gouges more closely. They were deep, cutting into the heartwood of the tree. Whatever had done this was powerful, far stronger than any animal I'd encountered in these woods before. I'll admit, my first instinct was to turn tail and head back the way I came. But curiosity got the better of me. I'd heard stories, of course, every hiker has. Tales of strange creatures in the deep woods, things that don't quite fit into our understanding of the natural world. I'd always written them off as campfire tales, but standing there, looking at those claw marks, I wasn't so sure anymore. So I pressed on, my eyes now scanning the forest around me with new intensity. It didn't take long to spot more signs, more claw marks on trees, branches snapped off at heights that made me dizzy to contemplate, and here and there, tufts of coarse, dark hair snagged on bark. The trail began to climb steeply, taking me into older, denser parts of the forest. The trees here were giants, their branches forming a cathedral-like canopy overhead. Very little sunlight penetrated, and I found myself checking my watch, acutely aware of how quickly the day was slipping away. That's when the smell hit me. It was musky and wild, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me oddly of rotting fruit. It was so strong it made my eyes water, and I found myself breathing through my mouth to avoid gagging. I've smelled bear, deer, even the occasional wild boar in these woods. This was something else entirely. It was primal, ancient, the kind of scent that speaks directly to the most primitive part of your brain, the part that knows when it's not at the top of the food chain. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that smell as possible. But I was rooted to the spot, my eyes darting around the shadowy forest, trying to pinpoint the source. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was deep, deeper than any sound I'd heard an animal make before, and it resonated in my chest like a bass drum. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I faced whatever was out there with courage, but the truth is, in that moment, I was more terrified than I'd ever been in my life. I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, all thoughts of following the trail forgotten. Branches whipped at my face, and I stumbled over roots, but I didn't slow down. I could hear something moving in the forest behind me, something big, crashing through the trees with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like lead, but still I pushed on, spurred by the sounds of pursuit behind me. Finally, I burst out of the tree line onto a small, rocky outcrop. The sudden openness was disorienting after the dense forest, and I stumbled, nearly going over the edge. As I caught my balance, I realized the sounds of pursuit had stopped. Gasping for breath, I turned to face the forest, half expecting to see some monstrous creature emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the dark line of trees, silent and still in the fading light. As my breathing slowed and my panic ebbed, I began to feel a bit foolish. Had I really just run pell-mell through the woods, chased by nothing more than my own imagination? But then the breeze shifted, and I caught that scent again, fainter now, but unmistakable. And there, at the edge of the forest, I saw it. Just for a moment, a shadow darker than the surrounding shadows, a shape that was almost human, but too tall, too broad. I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting the last of the daylight, and then it was gone, melting back into the forest as silently as a thought. I didn't wait around to see if it would return. I picked my way down the outcrop and found a trail, one I recognized as leading back to the main park area. I've never hiked so fast in my life, constantly looking over my shoulder, starting at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. By the time I reached my car, night had fully fallen. As I drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to write it off as an overactive imagination, a bear or deer blown out of proportion by fear and fading light. But I knew deep down that what I'd encountered was something else entirely. In the days that followed, I pored over local folklore, researched cryptid sightings in the area. I found stories of a creature called the Yahoo, a Bigfoot-like being said to roam the Appalachian Mountains. The descriptions matched what I'd seen all too well. I debated reporting what I'd experienced, but who would believe me? I had no proof, no photos, nothing but my own rattled testimony. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself. But I did make some changes. I still hike, still spend time in the woods, but now I stick to well-traveled paths, and I never go out alone. And on quiet nights when the moon is full, I sometimes think I hear a distant, rumbling growl carried on the wind. It's a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the dark places where humans rarely tread. So if you're ever hiking in the Appalachians and you come across claw marks too high up a tree, or catch a whiff of a musky, sweet scent that sets your hair on end, my advice is this: turn around. Go back to the safety of your car, your home, your world of streetlights and smartphones. Because out there in the wilderness, in the deep, dark heart of the mountains, there are ancient things that still roam. Things that should be left alone. As for me, I'll never forget that day, or the glimpse I caught of something that shouldn't exist. It's a memory that haunts me still, a reminder that no matter how well we think we know nature, it will always have its secrets, and some of those secrets have claws and eyes that shine in the darkness, and a scent that speaks of things ancient and wild. In the end, I've come to realize that the wilderness isn't just a place. It's a state of mind, a reminder that beyond the edges of our civilized world, there are still mysteries to be found. And sometimes, if we're not careful, those mysteries find us. Story 16. I've investigated hundreds of livestock attacks in my career as a ranch security consultant, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on the Miller farm. My name is Steve Hawkins, and this is the story of how a routine case led me to question everything I thought I knew about predators and the natural world. It was a crisp October evening when I received the call from Tom Miller, a cattle rancher in eastern Colorado. His voice was tight with stress as he described the recent string of attacks on his herd. At first, I assumed it was the usual culprits, coyotes, maybe a mountain lion. But as Tom went into detail, describing the savagery of the attacks and the size of the creatures he'd glimpsed, I knew this was something different. I arrived at the Miller Ranch the next afternoon, the vast expanse of the high plains stretching out in all directions. Tom met me at the gate, his weathered face etched with worry lines. "Thanks for coming, Steve," he said, shaking my hand. "I'm at my wit's end here." As we toured the property in his battered pickup, Tom filled me in on the details. Over the past month, he'd lost a dozen cattle, but it wasn't just the number that was troubling, it was the manner of the kills. The animals had been torn apart with a ferocity that went beyond normal predator behavior, and stranger still, some of the carcasses had been arranged in what almost looked like deliberate patterns. "I've been ranching for 30 years, Tom said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Never seen anything like it, and then there's the tracks." He pulled over near a creek bed and led me to a patch of soft mud. There, clear as day, was a set of prints that made my blood run cold. They were huge, easily twice the size of a wolf's, with distinct claw marks at the end of each toe. But what really set them apart was their shape. They looked almost human. I snapped photos and took measurements, my mind racing through possibilities. Could this be some kind of mutant wolf, an escaped exotic pet? Or was I looking at something entirely unknown to science? As the sun began to set, we headed back to the ranch house. I set up my equipment, motion-activated cameras, infrared sensors, the works. If whatever was attacking the cattle came back, I was going to catch it on film. The first 2 nights passed uneventfully. I spent my days examining the property, looking for signs of the predator, and my nights monitoring the cameras. Tom's wife, Sarah, kept me well fed with home-cooked meals, but I could see the toll the attacks were taking on the family. Their teenage son, Jake, jumped at every sound, and Sarah's eyes constantly darted to the windows, scanning the darkness beyond. It was on the 3rd night that everything changed. I was in my makeshift command center in the barn, surrounded by monitors, when one of the alarms went off. I switched to the camera feed and felt my heart stop. There, in the grainy night vision image, was a figure moving among the cattle. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and moved with an unsettling mix of grace and raw power. I radioed Tom and grabbed my rifle, racing towards the pasture. The cool night air bit at my face as I ran, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I could hear the panicked lowing of cattle, and underneath it, a low, rumbling growl that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. As I reached the edge of the pasture, I saw it. The creature was hunched over a fallen cow, its back to me. In the moonlight I could make out matted fur and impossibly long limbs. This was no wolf, no mountain lion. This was something else entirely. "Hey!" I shouted, raising my rifle. The creature's head snapped up, and it turned to face me. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Its face was a nightmarish blend of wolf and human, with glowing eyes that reflected the moonlight like a predator's. For a moment, we stared at each other, frozen in a tableau of mutual shock. Then it moved, faster than anything that size had a right to. I fired, the gunshot shattering the night's silence, but the creature was already gone, melting into the shadows with unnatural speed. Tom arrived moments later, shotgun in hand, but there was no sign of the attacker. All that remained was the mangled cow carcass and a set of those distinctive tracks leading off into the darkness. We spent the rest of the night on high alert, but the creature didn't return. As dawn broke, I reviewed the camera footage, my hands shaking as I fast-forwarded through the images. Most of the shots were blurry, the creature moving too fast for the camera to capture clearly. But one image made my blood run cold. A clear shot of the creature's face, its eyes staring directly into the camera with an intelligence that was anything but animal. I debated what to do with the evidence. Part of me wanted to call in every wildlife expert and cryptozoologist I could find. This was the discovery of a lifetime, proof of a creature that shouldn't exist. But as I looked at Tom and his family, saw the fear and exhaustion in their eyes, I knew I couldn't subject them to that kind of scrutiny. In the end, I made a call to an old friend at the Fish and Wildlife Service. I described the attacks as the work of an unusually large and aggressive wolf, leaving out the more unbelievable details. They promised to send a team to investigate and potentially relocate the animal. As I packed up my gear, Tom pulled me aside. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. "What the hell was that thing?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "I'm not sure, Tom. But whatever it is, it's not going to bother you anymore. The authorities will handle it from here." He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he knew I was holding back. As I drove away from the ranch, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a mistake, that by burying the truth, I was leaving the Millers, and who knew how many others, vulnerable to something beyond our understanding. I've spent the month since that night poring over folklore and cryptozoology texts, searching for any mention of a creature that matches what I saw. The closest I've come are legends of skinwalkers from Native American mythology, shapeshifters that can take on animal form. But those are just stories, aren't they? Sometimes, on dark nights, when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself thinking about that creature on the Miller Ranch. I wonder if it's still out there, stalking the high plains. I wonder if I should have done more, said more. And I wonder what other secrets the vast wilderness of our world might be hiding. So the next time you're driving through the countryside at night and you see something large moving in the shadows at the edge of your headlights, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the monsters from our nightmares are all too real, and sometimes the greatest predators are the ones we don't even know exist. Story 17. I've always loved camping, but after that night in the Rockies, I'm not sure I'll ever sleep soundly in a tent again. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen, and some encounters leave scars that run deeper than any physical wound. My name's Ryan, and I've been an avid outdoorsman for as long as I can remember. I've camped in deserts, forests, and mountain ranges across the country, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that crisp autumn night in Colorado's Pike National Forest. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my 3 closest friends, Mike, Sarah, and Jake. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the city and enjoy some quality time together under the stars. We chose a remote spot, about a day's hike from the nearest ranger station, known for its pristine beauty and abundant wildlife. The hike-in was uneventful, filled with laughter and friendly banter as we made our way through towering pines and past crystal-clear streams. By late afternoon, we'd reached our campsite, a small clearing nestled against a rocky outcropping. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and spent the remaining daylight exploring the area. As night fell, we gathered around our campfire, enjoying some well-earned beers and swapping stories. The forest around us was alive with the usual nighttime sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. It was peaceful, familiar. We felt at home. It must have been around midnight when things started to feel off. I noticed it first. A subtle change in the atmosphere, as if the forest had suddenly gone on high alert. The night sounds quieted, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. "Hey guys," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Is it just me, or did it get really quiet all of a sudden?" The others paused, listening. "Yeah, that's weird," Mike agreed, his brow furrowing. "Maybe there's a predator nearby? Mountain lion or something?" We all instinctively moved a little closer to the fire, our eyes scanning the darkness beyond its comforting glow. That's when we heard it, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was footsteps, heavy deliberate footsteps, moving through the forest with a slow, measured pace. They seemed to be circling our campsite, staying just out of sight in the shadows. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice wavering slightly. "Is someone there?" No response, just those footsteps, continuing their ominous circuit around our camp. We scrambled to our feet, grabbing flashlights and huddling together. Sarah, always the practical one, suggested we make some noise to scare off whatever animal might be out there. We started shouting and banging pots together, the cacophony echoing through the trees. For a moment, it seemed to work. The footsteps stopped, and we all breathed a collective sigh of relief. But then, just as we were starting to relax, we heard something that turned my blood to ice. A low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was deep, resonating in my chest, and carried an unmistakable note of menace. This was no ordinary animal. That's when we saw it. Just beyond the edge of our firelight, a massive shape emerged from the shadows. At first I thought it was a bear, but as it moved into view, I realized it was something else entirely. It stood on two legs, towering over us at what must have been 8 or 9 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its arms hung long at its sides, ending in hands tipped with wicked-looking claws. But it was the face that truly chilled me to the bone. It was a bizarre mix of ursine and human features, with a pronounced snout and small, glittering eyes that reflected the firelight with an eerie intelligence. For what felt like an eternity, we all stood frozen, staring at this impossible creature. It regarded us with what seemed like curiosity, its head tilting slightly as it studied our terrified faces. Then, with a speed that belied its enormous size, it moved. In 3 massive strides, it crossed the clearing and swiped at our food cache, sending our supplies scattering across the ground. We broke from our paralysis, scrambling backwards towards the tents. I heard Sarah scream, saw Mike fumbling with his phone, trying desperately to call for help despite the lack of signal. The creature paid us no mind, focused entirely on rummaging through our food. It tore open packages with ease, consuming everything in sight with a voracious appetite. All the while, that musky, wild scent I'd noticed earlier grew stronger, mixing with the smell of our campfire and creating a nauseating cocktail that made my head spin. "We need to get out of here," Jake whispered urgently, "while it's distracted." Slowly, carefully, we began to edge towards the trail. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the creature would hear it, but it remained focused on our supplies, seeming content to ignore us as long as we didn't make any sudden moves. We were almost to the tree line when disaster struck. Mike, bringing up the rear, tripped over a root and fell with a startled cry. The creature's head snapped up, its eyes locking onto us with predatory focus. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then, with another of those bone-chilling growls, it started towards us. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her along with me. We crashed through the underbrush, all thoughts of following the trail forgotten. Branches whipped at our faces and we stumbled over roots, but we didn't slow down. I could hear the creature behind us, moving through the forest with terrifying speed. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like lead, but still I pushed on, spurred by the sounds of pursuit behind us. Finally, we burst out of the tree line onto a small rocky outcrop. The sudden openness was disorienting after the dense forest, and we all stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath. As we turned to face the forest, expecting at any moment to see that monstrous shape emerge from the shadows, we realized the sounds of pursuit had stopped. The forest was silent once more, save for our ragged breathing. We waited, tense and alert, for what felt like hours. But nothing emerged from the darkness. Whatever that creature was, it seemed content to let us go. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of our situation set in. We were lost in the wilderness, in the middle of the night, with no supplies and no idea which way led back to civilization. The only thing we knew for certain was that we couldn't go back the way we'd come. It was Sarah who saved us. She had the presence of mind to grab her backpack as we fled, and in it was a small emergency kit with a compass. Using the stars and her basic orienteering skills, she was able to guide us in what we hoped was the direction of the ranger station. We hiked through the night and most of the next day, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. By the time we stumbled into the ranger station, we were exhausted, dehydrated, and more than a little hysterical. The rangers were skeptical of our story, of course. They suggested we'd encountered a particularly aggressive black bear, our fear transforming it into something more monstrous in our minds. Part of me wanted to believe them, to write off the whole experience as a product of fear and darkness, but I knew what I'd seen. We all did. That creature, whatever it was no bear. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist in our rational modern world. In the days that followed, we debated whether to go public with our experience. In the end, we decided against it. Who would believe us? We had no proof, and the idea of drawing attention to ourselves, and possibly to the creature, was unappealing. I still go camping, I still love the outdoors, but now when night falls and the forest grows dark, I listen a little more carefully to the sounds around me, and sometimes, when the wind is right and the moon is full, I think I hear something moving out there in the shadows, something big, something ancient, something that reminds me that we're not alone in this world, not by a long shot. So if you're ever camping in the Rockies and you hear heavy footsteps circling your camp, or catch a glimpse of something impossibly large moving through the trees, my advice is this: don't run, don't investigate, pack up, stick together, and get back to civilization as quickly and quietly as you can. Because out there in the wilderness, there are things that defy explanation, things that should be left alone. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky, those things find you. Story 18. I've been a wildlife researcher for over 2 decades, but nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of northern Michigan. My name is Jake Thompson, and this is the story of how my skepticism was shattered by something that defies explanation. It all started with a series of unusual reports from the Upper Peninsula. Locals were describing encounters with a creature they called the Michigan Dogman, a large bipedal canine that seemed more myth than reality. As a scientist, I was naturally skeptical, but the consistency of the reports and the credibility of some witnesses piqued my curiosity. I decided to investigate, thinking at best I'd uncover an interesting case of mass hysteria, and at worst I'd spend a week camping in beautiful forest land. I arrived in the small town of Manistique on a chilly September morning, my truck loaded with high-tech camera equipment, motion sensors, and enough gear for a week in the wilderness. The locals were friendly, but guarded when I mentioned the reason for my visit. Most would clam up or change the subject, but a few shared stories in hushed tones, tales of howls that didn't sound quite wolf or human, of massive paw prints found near mutilated livestock, of shadowy figures glimpsed at the edge of the forest. I set up my base camp in a clearing about 10 miles from town, deep in the Ottawa National Forest. It was pristine wilderness, the kind of place where you could almost believe you were the first human to set foot there. As I unpacked my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to the power of suggestion, all those stories getting into my head. The first few days were uneventful. I set up camera traps along game trails and near areas where sightings had been reported. During the day, I explored the forest, looking for any signs of unusual activity. I found plenty of normal wildlife signs, deer tracks, bear scat, the occasional wolf print, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was on the 4th night that things changed. I was sitting by my campfire, reviewing the day's footage on my laptop, when I heard it, a howl that made my blood run cold. It started like a wolf's call, but transformed into something else. A sound that was almost words. I fumbled for my audio recorder, but by the time I got it running, the forest had fallen silent again. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me bolt upright in my tent. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I finally drifted off into an uneasy slumber. I woke to the sound of my proximity alarms blaring. Grabbing my camera, I burst out of the tent. The clearing was empty, but the alarms kept screaming. I raced to the nearest camera trap, my heart pounding in my chest. The camera was gone, not just turned off or knocked over, completely vanished. In its place was a set of tracks that made me question my sanity. They were canine in shape, but enormous, and the stride length suggested a bipedal gait. And there, caught in a nearby bush, was a tuft of coarse, reddish-brown hair. My hands shook as I bagged the hair sample. This was evidence, real, tangible evidence of something unexplainable. I spent the rest of the morning checking my other cameras. 3 more were missing, with similar tracks nearby. Whatever had taken them was intelligent enough to target my equipment specifically. I retreated to my camp, my mind racing. Should I call for backup, report my findings? But who would believe me without the camera footage? I decided to stay one more night to see if I could capture any more evidence. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to close in around me. The usual nighttime sounds, owls, crickets, the rustle of small animals, were conspicuously absent. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the pounding of my own heart. Around midnight, I heard movement in the underbrush. I grabbed my night vision camera, my palms slick with sweat. Through the greenish glow of the viewfinder, I saw something that defied belief. It was large, at least 7 feet tall, and covered in shaggy fur. It moved with an unsettling mix of canine and human gait, its massive head swiveling as it scanned the clearing, and its eyes caught the infrared light and glowed like embers. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper, I'm not sure. But suddenly, those glowing eyes were fixed directly on me. Time seemed to stop as we stared at each other, predator and prey, separated by mere yards and a thin veil of technology. Then it moved, faster than anything that size had a right to. I dropped the camera and ran, blind panic driving me deeper into the woods. I could hear it behind me, branches snapping under its weight. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. Eventually, I found myself on the edge of a logging road, the first hints of dawn lightening the sky. There was no sign of pursuit, but I didn't stop moving until I reached my truck, parked miles away at the forest entrance. As I sped back towards town, my mind raced. What had I seen? What would I tell people? I had the hair sample, but without the camera footage, who would believe my story? When I reached cell phone range, my phone exploded with notifications. Missed calls, texts, emails, all from my research team back at the university. Apparently my camera traps had been uploading footage to the cloud before they were destroyed. But what they captured made no sense. The videos showed glimpses of the creature, but they were distorted, glitchy. In some frames it appeared as a normal wolf. In others, it was the bipedal monstrosity I had seen. And in a few, it seemed to flicker between forms, as if the camera couldn't quite capture its true nature. I spent the next week holed up in a motel room, poring over the footage, analyzing the hair sample, and trying to make sense of what I had experienced. The hair came back as unknown canid, similar to wolf, but genetically distinct. The videos defied explanation, seeming to change slightly with each viewing. In the end, I decided not to publish my findings. The evidence was too inconsistent, too bizarre. I knew what I had seen, but I also knew that without solid, irrefutable proof, I would be labeled a crackpot, my career in ruins. I've returned to the Upper Peninsula several times since that night, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature, to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. but the forest keeps its secrets well. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I can hear that unearthly howl again, calling from the depths of the wilderness. So the next time you're hiking in the deep woods, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, like you're being watched, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the most incredible discoveries are the ones we're least prepared to accept. And remember that in the vast wilderness of our world, there may still be things that defy our understanding, creatures that blur the line between reality and myth. As for me, I'll keep searching, because I know the truth is out there, hidden in the shadows of the forest, waiting to be uncovered, and maybe, just maybe, next time I'll be ready when it reveals itself. Story 19. I used to think the scariest thing about night fishing was the possibility of hooking yourself with your own lure, but after what I saw on that moonlit lake in northern Minnesota, I realize how wrong I was. Some waters run deeper than we can fathom, and some secrets should remain beneath the surface. My name's Dave, and I've been an avid angler for most of my life. There's something about the quiet solitude of a lake at night that's always called to me. The gentle lapping of waves against the boat, the occasional splash of a fish jumping, it's always been my idea of perfect peace. Or at least it was, until that night on Lake Kabetogama. It was late September, and I'd decided to take advantage of the last few weeks of decent weather before the harsh Minnesota winter set in. I'd heard rumors of monster walleye in Kabetogama, and I was determined to land a trophy fish. So I packed up my gear, loaded my small fishing boat onto my truck, and headed north. I arrived at the lake just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The lake was calm, its surface like glass, perfectly reflecting the changing colors above. As I launched my boat and motored out to a promising spot, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. The night was young, and who knew what it might bring? I cut the engine about a half-mile from shore, in an area where the lake bottom dropped off sharply, perfect walleye territory. I baited my line with a minnow, cast out, and settled in for what I hoped would be a productive night. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I caught a few decent-sized fish, nothing to write home about, but enough to keep things interesting. As midnight approached, a fog began to roll in, thick and low over the water. It wasn't unusual for this time of year, but it added an eerie quality to the night. The mist seemed to swallow up the sound, creating a bubble of silence around my little boat. It was around 1 a.m. when things started to get strange. I was reeling in my line, preparing to rebait, when I noticed something odd. The water around my boat seemed to be moving, not in the usual way, with waves or ripples, but almost as if it were alive. I leaned over the side, shining my flashlight into the depths. What I saw made my blood run cold. 2 eyes, large as dinner plates, stared back at me from just beneath the surface. They reflected the light of my torch with an eerie, greenish glow. For a moment, I thought I must be seeing things. Maybe I was more tired than I realized, or the fog was playing tricks on my eyes. But then those eyes blinked. I jerked back so quickly I nearly capsized the boat. My heart was pounding in my chest as I frantically scanned the water around me. The eyes had vanished, but I could feel something large moving beneath my boat, causing it to rock gently. That's when I heard it, a sound that I still hear in my nightmares. It was a deep, resonant call, somewhere between a whale's song and the low rumble of distant thunder. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the water and up into my boat. I'd like to say I kept my cool, that I faced whatever was out there with courage. But the truth is, in that moment, I was more terrified than I'd ever been in my life. I dropped my rod, letting it clatter to the bottom of the boat, and scrambled for the outboard motor. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grasp the starter cord. I pulled once, twice, 3 times, but the engine refused to catch. All the while, I could feel something circling my boat, something big enough to create waves that lapped at the sides. On the fourth pull, the motor roared to life. I didn't even wait for it to warm up before throwing it into gear and opening the throttle wide. The boat leapt forward, bow rising as it planed out over the water. I raced through the fog, my eyes straining to see more than a few feet ahead. I had no idea if I was heading towards shore or further out into the lake. All I knew was that I had to get away from whatever was behind me. Suddenly, something large broke the surface just off my port side. In the dim moonlight filtering through the mist, I caught a glimpse of a long, serpentine neck rising from the water. It was covered in scales that glistened wetly, and atop it sat a head that was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was vaguely horse-like, but with a mouthful of sharp teeth and those same glowing eyes I'd seen earlier. I jerked the tiller hard to starboard, nearly throwing myself from the boat in the process. The creature, and God help me, I don't know what else to call it, dove back beneath the surface with a splash that sent spray across my face. I don't know how long I raced through the fog. It could have been minutes or hours. My world had narrowed to the small circle of visibility around my boat and the constant, paralyzing fear of what might be lurking just beyond. When I finally saw the shoreline looming out of the mist, I nearly cried with relief. I ran the boat up onto the pebbly beach, not even bothering to properly dock it. I scrambled out, my legs wobbly from fear and the long time spent on the water. As I stood there on the shore, gasping for breath, I turned to look back out at the lake. The fog was starting to lift, and in the faint pre-dawn light, I could see the surface of the water. It was calm and still, betraying no hint of the terror I'd just experienced. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that it had all been a hallucination. Maybe I dozed off in the boat and had a particularly vivid nightmare. But then I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There, on the side of my boat, were 3 long gouges. They ran from the gunwale down to the waterline, deep enough to expose the fiberglass beneath the paint. Whatever had made those marks was no fish, and no nightmare I'd ever had left physical evidence behind. I reported the incident to the local authorities, of course. They were skeptical, to say the least. They suggested I'd hit a submerged log, or maybe had an encounter with an unusually aggressive muskie. Part of me wanted to believe them, to write off the whole experience as a product of fear and darkness and an overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. That creature, whatever it was real. And it's still out there, swimming in the depths of Lake Kabetogama. In the weeks that followed, I did some research. I found stories, old legends of the Ojibwe people who originally lived in the area. They spoke of a creature called the Mishipeshu, a great lynx-like beast that lived in the lakes and rivers. The descriptions varied, but many mentioned a long neck, scales, and glowing eyes. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe me? I had no proof beyond the scratches on my boat, which could be explained away by any number of mundane causes. But I know the truth. I still fish. I still love being out on the water. But now, when I'm on a lake at night, and I hear an unusual splash, or feel something large move beneath my boat, I can't help but wonder. And I never, ever lean over the side to look into the depths. So if you're ever night fishing on a northern lake, and you see 2 large glowing eyes looking up at you from the water, my advice is this: don't investigate. Don't try to get a closer look. Start your motor, head for shore, and don't look back. Because in the deep, dark waters of this world, there are things that defy explanation, things that should be left alone, and sometimes, if you're very unlucky, those things find you. Story 20. I've always believed that if you listen closely enough, nature will reveal its secrets. But after that day in the Adirondacks, I realized some secrets are better left unheard. There are whispers in the wild that can shake the very foundation of what we think we know about the world around us. My name's Greg, and I've been an avid birdwatcher for over 2 decades. There's something magical about spotting a rare species, capturing that fleeting moment when an elusive bird reveals itself. I've traveled across the country in pursuit of this passion, but it was in the familiar forests of upstate New York where I encountered something that defied all natural explanation. It was early May, prime migration season, and I'd taken a week off work to explore a remote area of the Adirondack Mountains. The region was known for its diverse bird population, and I was hoping to add a few new species to my life list. I'd set up camp in a small clearing, planning to use it as a base for daily excursions into the surrounding forest. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. I spotted several species I'd never seen before, including a gorgeous cerulean warbler that had me grinning for hours. But it was on the 4th day that everything changed. I'd woken before dawn as usual, eager to catch the morning chorus. The air was crisp and cool, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I made my way along a narrow trail, my binoculars hanging ready around my neck, I felt that familiar thrill of anticipation. What would I see today? As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the canopy, the forest came alive with sound. The sweet trill of a wood thrush, the rhythmic tapping of a pileated woodpecker, the buzzy song of a black-throated green warbler. It was a symphony of avian voices. But then, cutting through the familiar birdsong, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a call unlike anything I'd ever heard before. A high, keening wail that sent shivers down my spine. It was too loud, too intentional to be any bird I knew of. Intrigued and a little unnerved, I decided to investigate. I moved slowly, carefully, my ears straining to catch any repeat of the strange sound. The normal forest noises seemed to have dimmed, as if the woods itself was holding its breath. I'd been walking for about 10 minutes when I heard it again, closer this time. It was followed by a rustling in the underbrush off to my left. My heart began to race as I turned towards the sound, raising my binoculars. What I saw through those lenses will stay with me for the rest of my life. At first, all I could make out was movement, something large pushing through the dense foliage. Then it stepped into a small clearing, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The creature, and God help me, I don't know what else to call it, stood at least 8 feet tall. Its body was lean and muscular, covered in a patchwork of fur and what looked like scales. But it was the face that truly chilled me to the bone. It was elongated, almost wolf-like, with a mouth full of sharp teeth and eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. For a moment, our gazes met through my binoculars. I saw intelligence in those eyes, an awareness that went far beyond any animal I'd ever encountered. And then, as if sensing my presence, it turned its head and let out that same haunting cry I'd heard earlier. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I watched in awe at this incredible discovery. But the truth is, in that moment, every instinct I had screamed at me to run. I lowered my binoculars and stumbled backwards, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. As I turned to flee, I heard it moving through the forest behind me. It was fast, far faster than something that size should be able to move. Branches snapped and leaves rustled as it gave chase. I ran blindly, all thoughts of the trail forgotten. My only goal was to put as much distance between myself and that creature as possible. I crashed through underbrush, leapt over fallen logs, my lungs burning with each gasping breath. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that eventually I burst out of the tree line into a small meadow. The sudden openness was disorienting after the dense forest, and I stumbled to a stop, bent over and gasping for air. As I stood there trying to catch my breath, I realized the sounds of pursuit had stopped. The forest behind me was silent, save for the pounding of my own heart. Had I lost it, or had it simply given up the chase? Slowly, cautiously, I turned to face the woods I'd just fled through. The tree line stood dark and imposing, betraying no hint of the terror that had driven me here. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, just at the edge of the forest, I saw it. The creature stood half hidden behind a massive pine, watching me. Even at this distance, I could feel the weight of its gaze. It made no move to approach, simply observing with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. We stayed like that, locked in a silent standoff for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a grace that belied its size, it turned and melted back into the forest, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. I stood rooted to the spot for several more minutes, half expecting it to reappear, but the forest remained still and silent. Eventually, my racing heart began to slow, and the reality of my situation set in. I was lost, alone in an unfamiliar part of the wilderness, with no supplies and no idea which way led back to my camp. It took me most of the day to find my way back, navigating by the sun and the vague memories I had of the surrounding landscape. By the time I stumbled into my campsite, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks that I was too exhausted to appreciate. I spent a restless night in my tent, jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. The next morning I packed up and left, my week-long trip cut short by an encounter I still couldn't fully process. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I pored over field guides, searched online forums, even reached out to some cryptozoology groups. I found stories, old legends from the indigenous peoples of the area, tales of shapeshifters and forest spirits. But nothing quite matched what I'd encountered. I debated whether to report what I'd seen. In the end, I decided against it. Who would believe me? I had no proof, no photos, nothing but my own rattled testimony. And part of me felt that revealing the creature's existence would be a betrayal somehow. Those eyes had held too much intelligence, too much awareness, for me to expose it to the world without its consent. I still go birdwatching. I still love being out in nature. But now, when I'm in the woods and I hear an unusual call or see movement out of the corner of my eye, I can't help but wonder. And I never, ever assume I'm the only one doing the watching. So if you're ever out in the wild and you hear a sound you can't explain, or spot something that doesn't quite fit with what you know of the natural world, my advice is this: don't investigate. Don't try to get a closer look. Leave the area calmly but quickly, and count yourself lucky for the glimpse you got of a world beyond our understanding. Because out there in the wilderness, there are things that defy explanation. Things that remind us that no matter how much we think we know about nature, it will always have its secrets, and some of those secrets have teeth and eyes that glow in the darkness, and a way of turning the watcher into the watched when we least expect it. As for me, I'll keep exploring, keep listening to the voices of the wild. But now, I do it with a new perspective, always aware that I might not be the only one observing. In this vast, mysterious world of ours, sometimes we're the bird watchers and sometimes we're the ones being watched.